He was rebuilding his life after it was washed away.
Hurricane Harvey had such a devastating impact.
He lost his home. Still, he says, okay, this is the hand I was dealt. I'm going to keep going.
Even though it wasn't always easy.
He was suffering with mental illness and addiction.
He started going back to his doctor, and things got better.
Until weeks of silence led to a terrible discovery.
You in there?
He notices there's a smell.
I'll follow, brother.
What they find is a decomposing body.
Had struggles from his past snuck back in?
He's already dealing with a lot.
Could he have turned to drugs to drown his sorrows and accidentally overdosed?
Or is there more to this story?
They became closer friends, and eventually they had a sexual relationship.
She seemed a little bit jealous.
She was a compulsive liar.
She said, let me tell you something. I was like, what?
Theories are running wild at this point.
I'm confused. Again.
What has happened here?
January 20th, 2018. It's Saturday evening in Houston, Texas. A sprawling coastal city of more than 2 million, struggling to recover from the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey.
Hurricane Harvey more than devastated the city of Houston.
You can't really meet someone in Houston that wasn't affected in one way or another by Hurricane Harvey.
The storm's impact is one of the reasons Ethan Brock is on his way to the west side of town to check on his stepbrother, 34-year-old Melvin Maxwell Jr.
Melvin had been living in a hotel since getting displaced by Hurricane Harvey.
Been a few weeks, and Melvin's family has not heard from him.
Not only was cell service spotty in the hurricane's aftermath, Melvin had also stopped answering his hotel room's landline.
At first it would ring and then sound like somebody took it off the hook. I said, I wonder if he ignored me.
So that's why Ethan went by the hotel to just check on his brother.
There's a do not disturb sign on the door, but his brother ignores it.
Melvin, you in there?
He knocked on the door and nobody came.
Come on, Melvin. Not playing.
That's when Ethan catches the first whiff of real trouble.
His brother smelled something foul.
Instantly, he feels, oh my goodness, what has happened?
Melvin Maxwell Jr. had a tough life right from the start.
Melvin Jr. came into the world fighting. He was premature when he came in. They say he's gravely sick and we don't know if he's gonna survive. But he was a fighter.
But he could always rely on the loving support of his family.
I was his biggest cheerleader. I was crazy about him. His mom was crazy about him.
He is my only child. He was definitely a mama's boy. And he was my little guard, you know, my protector.
But it seemed there were always challenges trying to set him back.
He was smaller than most of the kids his age, and he struggled with that for a little while.
He was injured and lost his left eye at the time he was 3. And we didn't start seeing how it impacted his life till he got in school. And so he struggled reading.
But his tenacity helped him overcome any obstacle.
As he got older, he started going into football and weightlifting.
He did a lot of stuff, want to be bigger than what he was at the time.
But the one thing Melvin couldn't outgrow were issues with his mental health.
He had been diagnosed by the psychiatrist as being bipolar, but he was always trying to do good.
He was diagnosed with ADHD and then schizophrenia.
I did a lot of praying to overcome it, but it started coming prevalent when he became an older man.
Bipolar disorder, ADHD, schizophrenia, none of these are mental health disorders that impact your intellect. It's just about how you're able to receive and give out information.
The doctor prescribed their medications. But as he got older, he started having other kind of mental problems.
Eventually, Melvin's prescribed medication evolved into self-medication.
As he got older, I believe he used drugs and different things to lift him up and bring him down.
When someone has mental illness and they have an addiction, it's kind of figuring out, is it a correlation or is it a causation? And it's really hard to determine which one it is. The correlation is, I just want to numb the pain.
He got hooked on smoking weed, then he got hooked on popping pills, and he was constantly trying to stop, but he never could stop.
But despite the challenges Melvin faced, finding a date wasn't one of them.
He was very attractive, so he had a lot of lady friends.
His first kid was born when he was 16 years old.
But it was far from his last.
He ended up with 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls.
But while fatherhood came easy, finding a lasting relationship didn't.
He was married twice. His first wife, they got a divorce, and then he married his high school sweetheart.
But that relationship also ended in a separation.
But Melvin never turned his back on his children.
He adored all of his kids, and he was involved in each and every one of the lives of his kids.
He wanted to make sure that they had what they need. He was a good dad.
And he was determined to keep it that way.
He was really struggling. But when he started going back to his doctor, things got better.
Once he was regulated on his medication, Melvin was becoming a productive citizen.
It helped Melvin to become who he wanted to be, you know, a better father, a better son, a better brother, just showing up in a different way than how he had been showing up.
Then Hurricane Harvey made landfall in Texas.
Here comes Harvey, one of the most devastating hurricanes Houston has ever experienced. And Melvin loses everything once again.
He lost his home, I lost my home.
Melvin is already dealing with a lot. He's not just someone that has PTSD from the storm.
Despite the setback, Melvin is not fazed.
FEMA gave him a voucher for a hotel.
Which means Melvin could stay at a hotel of his choosing to get back on his feet.
With the voucher, Melvin moved into a hotel on the west side of Houston.
He says, okay, this is the hand I was dealt. I'm going to keep going.
And by the beginning of 2018, things seemed to be going pretty well.
He's still doing what he needs to do. He's still taking his medication.
So things are looking really good for Melvin.
But now his family is growing concerned after weeks of no contact from Melvin.
Mel, where there?
You have so many things swirling in your head. Is this person okay?
Come on, man. I'm not playing.
Are they at the hospital? Is he in jail? Did he hurt someone?
And his brother's worry only increases when he notices a foul smell coming from Melvin's hotel room.
It. It makes him uneasy. He decides to call 911.
I was find my brother. I came over to the hotel where he was at. I went to the room and I knocked, but nobody came to the door.
And you think he's in that room?
I'm hoping he's not.
He needs HPD to come to do a welfare check on his brother.
But when the police arrive, Melvin still doesn't answer.
Police.
So a hotel employee is called and unlocks it for the officer.
Once they open the door, they realize where the smell was coming from.
They find a decomposing body.
In Houston, Texas, 34-year-old Melvin Maxwell Jr. was working hard to get back on his feet after losing everything to Hurricane Harvey.
Natural disasters can have an everlasting impact on people. But then you add on the fact that he was suffering with mental illness and addiction. Those are two tremendous things to try to recover from. And so he was someone who was courageous.
But now Houston police officers have just found a dead body inside the room where Melvin has been living since the hurricane destroyed his home.
The body's so decomposed, they can't immediately identify who it is.
All they know for sure is that the body is a black male.
There's nothing that indicates foul play.
Call it in. I need the coroner to my location.
But just in case, officers notify the homicide unit.
The police also escort Ethan, who is Melvin's brother, out of the room.
He was overcome with emotion. Seeing a body that is unrecognizable is devastating because you just hope that, I think that's my brother, but I'm not really sure.
However, when detectives arrive on the scene, they quickly conclude that the body is likely Melvin's.
The room is rented to Melvin. There are prescription bottles found with Melvin's name on it. There's a wallet found, and his identifying information is still there.
There's also a social security card and some credit cards in Melvin's name.
So now they're just trying to figure out what has happened here.
When detectives take a closer look at the body, the level of decomposition makes it difficult to determine what happened to him.
The body's going to have to go to the medical examiner to make the final determination of whether foul play was involved.
Leaving CSI to process the scene, detectives head down to the lobby where Melvin's father and his brother Ethan are waiting.
After the officers escorted him out of the room, Ethan called the family with the news.
I was just devastated. Didn't want to live anymore.
Once Ethan called me and told me that he was dead, I came up to the hotel.
Melvin's father was willing to give the police any information they needed in regards to his son.
Can you tell us when was the last time you had contact with Melvin?
It's been a couple of weeks.
Melvin and his family communicate on a regular basis. They were able to see him during Christmas. They text him during the New Year. Things were going well for Melvin.
The last time that they spoke was on January the 4th.
And then all of a sudden, there's no communication whatsoever.
Initially, the family thought maybe he was having issues with his cell phone.
But they also informed detectives there were times when Melvin would go MIA.
It wasn't unusual for there to be a couple of days where they didn't hear from him.
My son had times in his life where he didn't want to be bothered, so he wouldn't call. And I just assumed he was going through a stage like that.
But then days with no word from Melvin turned into weeks.
They started to become worried, so that's what precipitated the welfare call.
If he has a history of silence, what made you more concerned this time around?
Ethan Melvin Sr. advised detectives of Melvin's long struggles with mental illness.
The investigators learned that Melvin Jr. had schizophrenia and bipolar. And so, he had his issues that he had to deal with.
On top of that, they tell detectives that Melvin has had to overcome addiction.
Melvin's been going through a lot lately, including losing his house to a heart.
Maybe Melvin had a manic episode and hurt himself or someone else.
Man, we called to everywhere that we could think of, but no one's seen it.
The family becomes extremely worried.
That's what made me drive up here tonight.
To detectives, it's seeming like Melvin's death isn't the result of a homicide at all.
Did he fall into depression?
Okay, you mentioned that he may have struggled with addiction. Is it possible that he could have overdosed?
Detectives investigating the death of Melvin Maxwell Jr. have learned that the 34-year-old had long been struggling with addiction, as well as his mental health.
Is it possible that he could have overdosed?
So detectives are wondering if Melvin's addiction got the best of him.
Ethan said now he would never overdose.
No, not Melvin. No way.
It will take an autopsy to determine the cause of death. But in the interim, detectives want to know if Melvin had problems with anyone.
After all, severe mental illness and addiction can have a negative impact on relationships.
The investigators want to know who's closest to Melvin.
Did he have any romantic relationships?
Well, he was divorced from his first wife, and then things fell apart with his second wife.
He had just broke up with my youngest grandson's mother, so they were married but separated.
He had also started a new relationship with a woman in Houston.
He decided on a rebound.
That rebound happens to be an older woman, 44-year-old Shaterika Purvis.
Melvin, is that you?
Oh, man, yeah.
Shaterika was a family friend.
What are you doing here?
I'm visiting my aunt, man. How you been?
Good, good.
He met Shaterika because Shaterika and her mother lived in the same apartment complex as my sister.
She and Melvin had known each other for some time, but had just reconnected recently.
We should get together sometime.
Okay. Definitely.
Shortly after that, they became closer friends, and eventually they had a sexual relationship.
But it's not just his romantic relationships detectives have to investigate.
Okay, guys, can you think of any other relationships, close friendships that he might have had? Actually, I believe he was friendly with one of the staff here at the hotel.
She's a security guard. He would come downstairs and he would talk to her sometimes.
All right, guys, thank you for your time. Thank you.
After wrapping up with Melvin's family, detectives check in with hotel management about this security guard.
They find out her name is Janelle Richards.
But she doesn't work here anymore, though.
Janelle had just resigned prior to the discovery of Melvin's body.
Oh, really?
The timing of her resignation is a little suspicious.
Detectives also want to know if anyone has been in Melvin's room recently.
He actually asked us to stop coming in a while ago.
His do not disturb sign was on the door.
Which means nobody had entered for weeks.
However, they did notice him come down for breakfast a few times during the new year.
But they don't remember him having breakfast past the first few days in January.
Given that the family's last communication with Melvin was on January 4th, and law enforcement discovered his body on January 20th, it creates a wide window of time that Melvin was unaccounted for.
Hindsight said I should have went to that hotel and checked on him once I wasn't able to get in contact with him for a couple of days. It was terrible for him to sit up in that room all that time.
Back at the station, detectives reach out to Janelle.
Hello? She's more than willing to talk.
She tells them, oh yes, I did strike up a friendship with Melvin.
I knew that he was there with the hurricane. I would see him every time I was at work.
They would speak from time to time when he would come downstairs to get something to eat or come downstairs for coffee.
You know, you see them almost every day. You talk to them, see how their day is. And so you begin to talk about your life.
Detectives want to know if Janelle ever saw Melvin with anyone.
Janelle states that she did see a woman with Melvin from time to time. She was a light-skinned black woman who appeared to be just a bit older than Melvin.
Never heard her name.
By all accounts, seems like it matches the description of Shaterica. So when officers asked Janelle if she noticed any friction between Melvin and Shaterica, Janelle says no.
Janelle tells them it seems like everything was fine.
But there was one time where she felt like Shaterica was kind of giving her a little attitude.
He didn't introduce us to anything. She just asked who was I, and he said that's the security, overnight security.
Shaterica seemed to be upset and maybe a little jealous.
Shaterica was a little bit older than Melvin, and she probably felt threatened walking into where he lives, seeing a beautiful security guard standing there that seems familiar with her boyfriend.
See you later. It was good seeing you.
You too.
Thank you.
Now wondering if jealousy could be the motive behind Melvin's death rather than an overdose, detectives turn their attention to Shaterica.
We just tasked with trying to find out what may have happened to him. I'm calling ahead because we'll be out of the office until Friday. But they're waiting to sit down for about, say, 9:30 on Friday.
Okay, then I'll see you at 9:30.
Almost a week after discovering Melvin's body, Shaterica arrives for her interview.
Shaterica comes down voluntarily.
Thank you for coming in. Can you tell us about your relationship with Melvin?
And she seems upfront when she sits down with detectives.
She reveals that she and Melvin are in a relationship and that relationship started in November around Thanksgiving.
I hadn't seen her for a long time, but we got together after the hurricane.
Shaterica tells the detectives that she, on occasion, stays with Melvin.
When was the last time you saw him?
It was the night of January 6th.
And there's a reason she remembers the date so clearly.
Shaterica decided to break things off with him that night.
I'm done. I'm done.
Hey, baby. Please don't go.
Shaterica Purvis has just told Houston detectives that Melvin Maxwell Jr. was alive and well when she left him on January 6th, the night she ended their relationship.
Now, detectives want to know what led up to the breakup.
We always had a lot of fun together, but that was a problem.
Her and Melvin were getting high and drunk together.
But then she left because he didn't have no money. She said that he ran out of money, so she left him.
She's frustrated. She tells police that on that night she waited until about 11 p.m. or so for Melvin to fall asleep. She quietly grabs her things. She goes to the lobby and she calls her daughter for a ride.
Called my daughter, she picked me up, and that was it.
They continue to question her. Has she heard from Melvin since that night? And she says no.
She had assumed once he woke up, he would understand because my stuff was not there that I did not want to see him or speak with him.
Okay.
You're free to go.
Thank you.
After talking to Shaterika, detectives make a call to her daughter to confirm her story.
Yes, it's correct. I picked up.
You remember what time?
No, I can't tell you what time because I was asleep. And when she called, I just got up.
She doesn't remember the time, but she does remember dropping her mother off at her grandmother's apartment.
She also tells detectives that she never really liked Melvin.
He's very disrespectful, so I talked to him.
Thank you.
After talking to the daughter, detectives feel like Shaterika's statement lines up.
It also matches the time frame given by Melvin's family and the hotel staff.
Had the breakup been one setback too many for Melvin?
Could he have turned to drugs to drown his sorrows and accidentally overdosed?
But an overdose is definitively ruled out when detectives get the autopsy results back from the coroner.
Melvin was stabbed.
The medical examiner found a 4-inch cut on the left side of the chest and a small cut under the right arm.
It wasn't easy for them to figure that out because Melvin's body has been decomposed for a couple of weeks at this point.
Based on this new information, detectives are again faced with a question.
Who could have done this?
With it being a stab wound and him being found in his hotel, it's got to be a crime of passion. So who would have had entrance and had the ability to be inside of that hotel room? And so now attention goes back to the security officer, Miss Janelle.
Maybe she was friendlier with Melvin than she had let on.
Or was it his girlfriend who, according to a statement, was likely the last person to see him alive?
Detectives aren't sure which avenue to pursue until a call comes in.
Out of nowhere, police get a tip from Melvin Sr. that he has spoken to a lady that lives in the complex with them, which Shaterika happens to be residing in.
The woman's name is Lorraine Wilson.
And according to Lorraine, Shaterika had come to her a couple weeks earlier with a shocking confession.
Y'all, I just killed someone.
What? Investigating the murder of Melvin Maxwell Jr. have just learned that his girlfriend, Shaterika Purvis, may have confessed to the crime.
According to Melvin's father, Shaterika told a neighbor named Lorraine Wilson that she had killed someone.
What? So police reach out to Lorraine.
Hello?
She tells them she is willing to speak with them.
So apparently you had talked with Mr. Melvin Maxwell Sr.?
Yes, sir.
Lorraine tells them that she doesn't know Shaterika very well, but they would see each other while in the complex. But they also shared a mutual friend who also lived in the complex.
And one night, she happened to run into Shaterika at the mailboxes.
And during this interaction, Shaterika seemed out of sorts.
And she said, I just don't feel like it's not feeling good.
Shaterika says, hey, do you know if Felicia is at home? And she's like, hey, I don't know, but I can walk upstairs with you to check it out.
Felicia was their mutual friend.
So they went to the apartment of Felicia Ramos, where she was with her cousin, Walter Ramos.
She followed behind me, kind of like upset.
When they come inside, Shaterika makes a unusual statement.
She said, let me tell you something. I just killed somebody. I was like, what? She said, I just killed somebody.
She said she got into it with this gentleman and she killed him.
Shit, I think we should not instead.
But Lorraine says she and the other two people in the room were skeptical.
I said, we don't look like it would have been for the blood. I thought she was playing.
Shaterica's known to make these wild stories up, so the majority of the people are just, blowing it off like, whatever.
Lorraine says she left shortly after and didn't think about it again.
It's not until she heard that Melvin was murdered at a hotel that causes Lorraine to reach out to Melvin Sr.
Thank you.
After hanging up with Lorraine, detectives immediately reach out to the two other witnesses mentioned in her statement.
Being a part of an investigation, you have to corroborate statements with other statements.
So police reach out to Felicia.
Did you recall her telling any kind of story to you with anyone else in this conflict?
I don't believe nothing nobody say.
Felicia basically says nobody pays attention to her. It's like the little boy who cried wolf.
So again, a second person had brushed it off because it seemed so random.
Felicia's cousin, Walter, echoes her sentiment.
It was late at night and we was having us a good time. So this lady came in and said, I just killed somebody. Nobody took it serious.
And so now it's three people that feels she's made up something.
Shaterica's statements seem damning to detectives.
You have people that are sharing what appears to be a confession.
But does that mean she is actually guilty?
Keep in mind, this is a person that's known for not always telling the truth.
Or maybe when she told Melvin she wanted to break up with him, things got out of hand.
So the investigators subpoenaed her phone records.
And when the records come back, investigators' suspicions about Shaterica grow.
It turns out Shaterica did not call her daughter on January 6th like she initially told police.
What they found out was that on January the 4th, in between 11:30 and midnight, Shaterica made a call to her daughter to come pick her up from the hotel.
This also lines up with the last day that Melvin spoke to his family.
They compare that to Melvin's phone records, and again, they see the last outgoing call was on January the 4th, and then there are a lot of incoming calls, but they went unanswered.
So now detectives are left wondering, did she mix up dates or did she lie on purpose?
Detectives decide they need to bring Shaterica back down to the station for another interview to clear things up.
But when they go by her place, they're met with a surprise.
They can't find her.
Shaterica is on the run.
When detectives investigating Melvin Maxwell Jr.'s murder attempt to locate Shaterica Purvis, hoping to clear up some discrepancies in her statement, she's suddenly nowhere to be found.
To detectives, it seems like a clear indication of guilt.
So at this point now, Shaterica is the prime suspect.
And with Shaterica now a fugitive, detectives contact the Gulf Coast Task Force.
We're less than 6 hours away from the border of Mexico. Most officers feel like, hey, we need to let Border Patrol know, and also let's let the U.S. Marshals know just in case she's trying to go on by a plane.
On June 28th, detectives get a hit.
What's up?
They get a phone call from Atlanta, Georgia.
It turns out she did indeed make a run for it, but it wasn't to the border or to Mexico. She was flagged in Atlanta while trying to board a flight to Jamaica.
She was going through U.S. Customs. They checked her name out and found out she had an open warrant for murder in Houston, Texas.
Customs agents take Shaterica into custody and contact the authorities in Houston.
Houston investigators came to interview her in Atlanta, and they asked her exactly what happened.
They are trying their best to get a confession, and Shaterica is not budging.
I told you I didn't do anything. I was just going on vacation.
They continued to press her.
They started throwing in different things in that interview, giving her a little room where maybe he got aggressive with you.
Slowly but surely, they break her down, and she starts to open up a little bit more.
Okay. It was the day of the 4th. We were having an argument about me leaving.
She tells them he came up from behind her and put his hand on her shoulders.
Don't go, please.
Shaterica explains to detectives that she had been assaulted in the past.
She was still a little nervous and skittish about being touched. So when Melvin puts his hands on her shoulder, she freaks out.
And because he wouldn't get out of her personal space, she grabbed a butcher knife and stabbed him.
Get away from me!
What?
The knife was one that they kept in the room for cooking.
She stabbed Melvin, and Melvin immediately goes and sits on the bed.
She tells officers that Melvin was still alive. He had sat on the bed. He was holding the spot where he was stabbed.
To Shaterica, hey, this was a minor injury. I just needed to get him off of me so I can leave. She packs up her stuff and she leaves.
I didn't mean to do it.
She assumed that he would call for help.
She didn't expect for him to die.
But for the detectives, her explanation comes far too late.
After giving her statement, her confession, Shaterica is arrested for murder.
In September 2021, Shaterica arrives back in Houston to await trial. And Melvin's family rejoices.
I think she thought she had got away with the crime. I was happy that they finally got her.
I had relief that finally justice would be served. Finally that we can have some kind of closure.
But Shaterica will never stand trial for Melvin's murder.
While she's awaiting trial, she took a plea deal. The state offered her 22 years for a murder charge, which she accepted.
She's eligible for parole after serving half her sentence.
We was hoping that she would get 45 years, but we didn't want to really go through that brutal thing of seeing all that evidence.
I don't know if I could have took it sitting up in court, looking at all the gory stuff and all the negativity that would be brought up about him, and he wasn't here to defend himself.
Instead, Melvin's family focuses on healing.
I forgave her for me, so I can live, and so I can continue to love my son, and continue to be there for his children. Nobody has control over them. Only God.
Although moving on doesn't mean letting go of the son and father they all loved.
His children are very resilient. Even the baby. I've got pictures all over the house. I talk to him every day about his dad. And so that he knows that his dad really loved him.
My prayers is to give me strength to make it through it. But I'm also a realist. You know, I realize that I'm never gonna be okay. It's heartbreaking. And no parent should bury their kid. It's just against all the rules of nature. It's hard, you never get over it.
Our children are precious, and they can be here today and gone tomorrow. I will always love Melvin Joseph Maxwell Jr., and may he rest in heaven peacefully.
The biting October wind swept across the desolate cornfields of rural Knox County, Ohio, on the crisp morning of October 12, 1989, carrying with it a chilling stillness that would forever shatter the illusion of Midwestern tranquility. Inside a modest, secluded farmhouse nestled at the end of an unpaved gravel lane, 32-year-old high school biology teacher David Vance lay lifeless on the cold linoleum floor of his mudroom. It was not a robbery gone wrong, nor was it a sudden domestic dispute that erupted into spontaneous rage. It was a cold, calculated execution executed with sickening, surgical accuracy. When local deputies breached the unlocked side door after a concerned neighbor reported David's absence from morning classes, they didn't find a home torn apart by violence or a frantic search for valuables. They found David slouched against a wooden bench, his eyes wide open in frozen terror, bearing a singular, fatal puncture wound to the chest that had pierced his heart with unbelievable, anatomical precision. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no muddy footprints trailing across the polished hardwood floors, only the faint, lingering scent of metallic copper, sweet almond oil, and the eerie silence of an empty countryside. The initial sweep of the crime scene baffled veteran investigators from the Knox County Sheriff's Office, who barricaded the perimeter under the flashing red strobe lights of patrol cruisers while local residents gathered at the edge of the cornfield in utter disbelief. The victim's wallet, containing several $100s in fresh bills, sat untouched on the kitchen counter alongside a warm cup of black coffee that had barely gone cold. It was a terrifying anomaly from the very first hour. A respected, quiet educator executed in his own home without a single whisper of a struggle, without a trace of forced entry, and without a single microscopic piece of evidence left behind by the killer. The news sent shockwaves through the tight-knit agricultural community, sparking intense fear that a phantom killer was stalking the rural highways of central Ohio. For 35 excruciating years, that horrifying morning remained an impenetrable wall of silence in the state's criminal archives, filed away under the ominous label of a haunting Ohio 1989 cold case. The autumn leaves swirled violently outside the small, makeshift command center set up inside the Knox County Courthouse as lead detective Richard Miller stood over the high-resolution crime scene photographs pinned to a corkboard. The air in the room was thick with stale tobacco smoke, cheap filter coffee, and the oppressive weight of a murder investigation that was rapidly slipping into darkness. Miller was a battle-tested investigator who had spent 2 decades dealing with rural homicides, but the sheer cleanliness of David Vance's murder chilled him to the core. David was a man of strict routine, a beloved local teacher who spent his evenings grading papers, volunteering at the local library, and tending to his modest farm property. Yet, sitting on the kitchen table were 2 ceramic mugs, one filled with David's usual black coffee, and a second mug bearing traces of chamomile tea that was still faintly lukewarm when deputies arrived. The lack of forced entry strongly suggested that David knew his assailant well enough to invite them inside during the early morning hours, brewing them a hot drink before receiving a lethal strike to the chest. The murder weapon itself was an enigma. Forensic pathologists noted that the lethal blow was delivered by an exceptionally long, needle-thin metallic instrument that left almost no external bleeding, causing massive internal hemorrhaging that ended David's life in a matter of seconds. How could an intruder enter a rural home at 6:30 a.m., drink tea with a victim, execute him with a specialized medical-grade weapon, and vanish into the surrounding fields without leaving a single fingerprint, shoe print, or strand of carpet fiber behind? The question hung over the investigation like a shroud as forensic technicians dusted every doorframe, windowsill, and countertop, retrieving absolutely nothing. No latent fingerprints, no hair follicles, no biological fluids that could point toward an identity. By noon, local news crews and regional television reporters had surrounded the barricaded perimeter on Highway 36, their broadcast lights illuminating the gray, overcast autumn sky. The news anchor's voice crackled through radio speakers across the county, describing the gruesome discovery as an unprecedented tragedy that defied logical explanation. In the surrounding township, a dense, paralyzing anxiety settled over the farmhouses. Residents began locking doors that had remained unlatched for generations, buying up shotguns at local hardware stores, and eyeing their closest neighbors with sudden, toxic suspicion. The preliminary canvass of the rural road yielded bizarre, conflicting reports from local residents. A farmer down the road claimed he heard a high-pitched metallic whine echoing across the valley at approximately 6:15 a.m., while a school bus driver swore she passed a dark blue sedan parked on the shoulder of the road with its hazard lights blinking, its driver hidden behind a thick coat and pulled-down cap. Neither lead brought the detectives any closer to a suspect, as the sedan had vanished before the bus made its return loop and the strange sound could not be replicated by any standard farm equipment. As days bled into weeks, the investigation into David Vance's private life revealed a man who lived like a monk, no secret debts, no hidden affairs, no grudges with students or colleagues, and no financial anomalies that could explain such a deliberate, professional hit. The investigators were staring into a void, a crime so devoid of physical evidence that it seemed almost supernatural in its execution. The formal autopsy report arrived on Detective Miller's desk 5 days later, offering a detail that completely flipped the direction of the homicide inquiry. David Vance had not been stabbed with a standard hunting knife, a kitchen blade, or an ice pick. The fatal puncture was made by a customized, solid steel surgical trocar, an instrument typically reserved for specialized veterinary procedures or embalming processes. The precision required to strike the left ventricle through the rib cage in a single, fluid motion without causing external bruising required advanced anatomical knowledge and immense physical composure under pressure. This was no panicked burglar caught off guard by a returning homeowner. This was a cold-blooded executioner who knew exactly how the human body functioned and how to end a life without spilling a drop of blood on the victim's clothing. Yet the core paradox remained wrapped in absolute darkness. Why target a humble, soft-spoken high school teacher in rural Ohio with the cold efficiency of a trained assassin? Was David keeping a dark secret that he took to his grave, or had he opened his door to someone who wore a face so familiar, so trustworthy, that he never even saw the steal coming? Miller spent endless nights sitting alone in his office, staring at the black and white photos of the 2 coffee mugs, tracing the invisible line between the guest who drank chamomile tea and the corpse slouched on the mudroom floor. As winter set in and snow covered the cornfields of Knox County, the investigation ground to an agonizing halt against an unyielding wall of silence. Detectives interviewed over 200 people, including David's fellow teachers, his students, local farmhands, and estranged acquaintances across the state of Ohio. Every single lead collapsed into a dead end. Alibis checked out, polygraph examinations were passed, and the financial records of everyone in David's circle showed no suspicious transactions or sudden windfalls. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was consulted, generating a offender profile that described a suspect who was deeply familiar with David's daily routine, possessed specialized technical or medical skills, and was capable of blending seamlessly into the local environment without attracting attention. Yet, despite thousands of hours of shoe-leather police work, no murder weapon was recovered, no suspect was formally named, and no motive was ever established. The case files, filled with yellowing notepad pages, blurred crime scene Polaroids, and taped interview cassettes, were eventually packed into heavy cardboard boxes and moved down into the cold storage room of the sheriff's department. The murder of David Vance became an urban legend whispered around winter bonfires, a dark, unresolved horror that haunted the county for decades as an unsolved Ohio 1980s cold case. 35 years passed, and the horrific events of October 1989 faded into the background of local history, becoming a somber story told by older residents to explain why farmhouses out on the highway kept their porch lights burning all night long. The original investigators retired, grew frail, and passed away, taking their personal theories and frustration to their graves, while the rural landscape of Knox County subtly transformed under the march of time. But cold case files in the modern era of law enforcement do not remain dead forever. They sit silently in storage rooms, waiting for the relentless evolution of forensic technology to outpace the arrogance of killers who believed they had executed the perfect crime. In the spring of 2024, a state-mandated audit of cold case evidence across Ohio brought the dusty box labeled Vance, David 1989, back into the bright light of a modern forensic laboratory in Columbus. A young, Tenacious cold case detective named Karen Mercer was assigned to review the forgotten evidence, armed with tools that were pure science fiction when Detective Miller walked the blood-stained mudroom 35 years prior. Mercer brought a cold, unbiased, analytical focus to the file, determined to squeeze answers from physical artifacts that had sat untouched inside cardboard boxes for over 3 decades. Among the preserved evidence items inside the box were the 2 ceramic mugs recovered from David Vance's kitchen table on the morning of the murder. In 1989, fingerprint lifting techniques on porous ceramic surfaces were rudimentary, and latent prints dusted with carbon powder had yielded only smudged, unclassifiable marks that were deemed useless for court proceedings. Furthermore, DNA profiling was in its absolute infancy, requiring large, fresh bloodstains that were nowhere to be found on the clean teacup. Detective Mercer sent the teacup to the state's Advanced Forensic DNA Unit, requesting state-of-the-art touch DNA extraction, vacuum-assisted swab sampling, and low-copy number genomic sequencing on the outer rim and handle, where the killer's lips and fingers had rested 35 years earlier. Technicians used specialized chemical buffers to lift microscopic, invisible skin cells that had bonded to the glaze of the ceramic over decades of dry storage. Against incredible odds, the laboratory successfully extracted a usable, highly detailed male DNA profile from the rim of the chamomile teacup, a microscopic genetic footprint left behind by the person who had sat across from David Vance minutes before his life was brutally stolen. The profile was immediately run through the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, searching for a direct hit against millions of convicted felons and arrestees nationwide. Days turned into weeks with no direct match, indicating that the individual who left their DNA on that teacup had never been convicted of a felony or entered into the National Criminal Database in the years following the murder. But modern forensics had another revolutionary tool available: forensic genetic genealogy. Detective Mercer uploaded the raw genomic profile to public and commercial genealogy databases, initiating a massive algorithmic search designed to locate distant familial relatives through shared DNA segments. The genealogy algorithm ran silently for 72 hours, mapping out vast, complex family trees that span generations of Midwestern families, until it locked onto a cluster of second and third cousins residing in central Ohio and Indiana. Genetic genealogists worked around the clock to narrow down the sprawling family branches, tracing the shared DNA markers back to a common ancestral couple who had settled in Ohio in the late 19th century. As the branches of the family tree were systematically eliminated through public records, birth certificates, and census data, the investigation converged with terrifying, mathematical certainty onto a single family line, the Vance family itself. The DNA on the teacup did not belong to an anonymous intruder, a wandering serial killer, or an international hitman. It belonged to a direct biological relative of David Vance. Detective Mercer felt a surge of adrenaline as she stared at the glowing monitor in her office, mapping out the immediate family of the victim. David Vance had only one sibling, an identical twin brother named Daniel Vance, who was 32 years old at the time of the murder and was currently living as a retired, respected pharmacist in the wealthy suburb of Dublin, Ohio, just 40 miles away from the crime scene. In 1989, Daniel Vance had been interviewed briefly by sheriff's deputies following his brother's death, but he was quickly dismissed as a suspect after providing a rock-solid alibi. He claimed he was attending a regional pharmaceutical conference in downtown Columbus at the time of the murder, verified by conference sign-in sheets and testimony from colleagues. Because David and Daniel were identical twins, their physical appearance was nearly indistinguishable, but in 1989, standard forensic science had no way of differentiating between the biological material of identical siblings. The revelation opened up a mind-bending forensic dilemma for Detective Mercer and her team. Identical twins develop from a single fertilized egg that splits in two, meaning they share a virtually identical nuclear DNA profile that standard short tandem repeat, STR, testing cannot distinguish. To standard forensic tests, David and Daniel Vance were genetically identical, meaning a standard DNA test could not prove whether the biological material on the teacup belonged to the victim or his surviving twin brother. However, cutting-edge ultra-deep genomic sequencing had recently made it possible to detect ultra-rare, somatic point mutations, microscopic genetic variations that occur spontaneously in individual cells after the fertilized egg splits in the womb. Mercer realized that to catch a killer who shared the victim's exact genetic blueprint, she would have to hunt for a needle inside a microscopic 3 billion-letter genetic haystack. The focus of the entire cold case investigation shifted instantly and intensely onto Daniel Vance, the quiet, retired pharmacist who had lived for 35 years under the radar of law enforcement while maintaining an impeccable reputation in his suburban community. Public records revealed that Daniel had built a highly lucrative career managing several independent medical supply pharmacies across central Ohio, specializing in veterinary compounds, surgical equipment, and specialized medical instruments. The realization hit Detective Mercer like a physical blow. As a compounding pharmacist with access to medical supply chains, Daniel Vance had direct, unrestricted access to surgical-grade trocars, chemical sedatives, and specialized embalming tools that were completely inaccessible to the general public in 1989. The profile of the killer, someone with specialized medical knowledge, familiar with David's daily routine, and capable of entering the home without suspicion, aligned perfectly with his identical twin brother. Undercover officers from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI, were deployed to place Daniel Vance under 24-hour physical and electronic surveillance at his gated suburban estate in Dublin, Ohio. The man who had potentially murdered his twin brother 35 years prior was now a 77-year-old silver-haired retiree who spent his afternoons playing golf, attending church services, and dining at upscale country clubs. To the outside world, he was a pillar of the community, a generous donor to local charities, and a loving family man. But to Detective Mercer, he was a master of deception who had walked away from an execution-style murder and built a life of luxury atop a foundation of cold, calculated fratricide. The challenge was securing a fresh, pristine biological sample from Daniel without alerting him that the 35-year-old cold case had been reopened. For 6 days, plainclothes detectives trailed Daniel as he ran routine errands across the northern suburbs of Columbus, waiting for the one careless moment every suspect eventually makes. The breakthrough occurred on a rain-slicked Thursday afternoon when Daniel pulled his luxury sedan into a high-end coffee shop drive-thru in Worthington. Undercover agents watched as Daniel finished a hot beverage, wiped his hands with a paper napkin, and tossed the used paper cup and napkin into a public trash receptacle outside a nearby dry-cleaning establishment before driving away. Within seconds of his departure, plainclothes officers secured the trash bin, recovering the disposable coffee cup and napkin in sterile evidence containers, preserving them for immediate transit to the state crime laboratory under armed escort. The state laboratory immediately initiated ultra-deep, whole genome sequencing on the DNA recovered from Daniel's coffee cup, comparing it against the high-resolution genetic data extracted from the 1989 teacup and the victim's preserved post-mortem blood samples. Molecular geneticists spent 2 agonizing weeks scanning the millions of base pairs of DNA, searching specifically for single nucleotide variants, SNVs, tiny, somatic mutations that had occurred in Daniel's cell line after the embryonic split. The scientific breakthroughs of 2024 delivered the ultimate, indisputable proof. The team discovered 3 distinct somatic point mutations present on the rim of the 1989 teacup that matched Daniel Vance's DNA perfectly, but were entirely absent in the preserved biological profile of his murdered twin, David. The physical and genetic evidence was now absolute, unbreakable, and terrifying in its implications. Daniel Vance had physically sat in his brother's kitchen on the morning of October 12, 1989, drank chamomile tea from a ceramic cup, and executed his identical twin brother with a surgical trocar before slipping away into the morning fog to attend his pharmaceutical conference in Columbus. Equipped with this revolutionary forensic match, Detective Mercer presented the evidence to a Knox County grand jury in a secret proceeding, securing a grand jury indictment and an emergency arrest warrant for first-degree aggravated murder. 35 years after the sirens wailed down Highway 36, the phantom killer of Knox County finally had a face, a name, and an impending date with justice. The tactical arrest operation was executed at dawn on a crisp October morning that mirrored the weather conditions of the day David Vance was killed 35 years prior. Armed SWAT officers and BCI agents surrounded Daniel Vance's sprawling suburban mansion, breaching the front perimeter and securing the residence with lightning speed. Daniel was taken into custody in his master bedroom, dressed in a silk bathrobe, offering no physical resistance as the iron cuffs were clicked around his wrists. His face remained entirely stoic, his eyes cold and unblinking, showing no panic or emotion as he was led out to a waiting police cruiser under the glaring lights of local news cameras that had rushed to the scene. The news headline broke across national media networks with explosive force, burning into the public consciousness. Ohio 1989 cold case solved. Twin brother arrested after 35 years. The arrest of Daniel Vance sent shockwaves through the quiet township of Knox County and the wealthy suburbs of Columbus, unearthing dark family secrets that had been buried beneath 3 decades of silent lies. As news of the twin brothers' arrest dominated headlines across the nation, media crews set up permanent camps outside the Knox County Sheriff's Office, broadcasting live reports on the miraculous forensic breakthrough that had brought down a 77-year-old killer. Meanwhile, a team of federal agents, state investigators, and forensic technicians descended upon Daniel Vance's Dublin estate with a comprehensive search warrant, determined to locate any physical evidence, hidden trophies, or documents tied to the 1989 murder that he might have kept over the years. For 48 hours, search teams used ground-penetrating radar, wall scanners, and trained evidence dogs to inspect every square inch of Daniel's 6,000-square-foot home, including a custom-built, climate-controlled wine cellar and a private home office. In the basement, behind a false wall panel located inside a built-in hardwood bookcase, investigators discovered a heavy, fireproof steel wall safe that required a complex digital combination and a physical key to open. Forensic locksmiths spent 3 hours bypassing the tumbler mechanisms, finally swinging the heavy steel door open to reveal a dark interior that smelled strongly of old metal, rubbing alcohol, and decaying leather. Inside the hidden safe, resting inside a velvet-lined wooden display case, was an antique, surgical-grade stainless steel trocar, a long, needle-thin instrument featuring a custom-molded brass handle designed for maximum grip and silent thrusting. Beside the instrument lay a yellowed, handwritten ledger from 1989 detailing a series of secret offshore bank accounts, forged power of attorney documents, and a multi-million-dollar inheritance trust that David Vance had unknowingly inherited from a distant maternal relative weeks before his death. The motive that had eluded investigators for 35 years was laid bare on the table. Pure, unadulterated greed coupled with intense, lifelong sibling jealousy. Financial forensic accountants assigned to the task force analyzed the yellowed ledger, uncovering a devious financial plot executed by Daniel Vance in the late 1980s. Weeks before the murder, Daniel had discovered that his brother David was the sole beneficiary of an offshore family trust valued at over $3 million, a fortune that David was planning to donate to an educational foundation for underprivileged rural students. Daniel, whose own medical supply business was secretly teetering on the brink of bankruptcy due to failed investments in 1989, realized that if David died without a spouse or a recorded will, the entire inheritance would automatically pass to him as the sole surviving immediate family member. The precise timeline of the crime was reconstructed through the combination of recovered ledger entries, forensic evidence, and historical conference records. On the morning of October 12, 1989, Daniel drove his dark blue sedan, the same vehicle spotted by the school bus driver, to David's farmhouse before dawn, entering through the unlocked side door using his identical appearance and twin bond to drop David's guard completely. He sat at the kitchen table, drank a cup of chamomile tea brewed by his brother, and waited for the exact moment David turned his back to grab a serving plate. In a single, cold-blooded motion, Daniel retrieved the surgical trocar from his coat and delivered a single, fatal strike to his brother's heart before David could even cry out for help. After verifying that David had passed, Daniel carefully wiped his footprints from the floorboards, collected his coat, and left the ceramic mugs on the table, unaware that his biological signature was trapped beneath the glaze of the teacup. He drove straight to downtown Columbus, checked into his pharmaceutical conference at 8 a.m., and established a rock-solid alibi that protected him from suspicion for 35 years. Over the next 3 decades, Daniel quietly liquidated the inherited trust funds, rebuilt his business empire, and lived a life of luxury while his brother lay in a cold grave in a rural Knox County cemetery.
Part 5.
The grand jury indictment was formalized, charging Daniel Vance with first-degree aggravated murder, grand larceny, and forgery, carrying a potential sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial was held at the historical Knox County Courthouse, the very building where Detective Miller had stared at the crime scene photos 35 years earlier, attracting legal scholars, true crime journalists, and former students of David Vance from across the country. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity every single day, filled with an unbearable tension as prosecutors laid out the overwhelming scientific and circumstantial evidence against the aging defendant. Daniel Vance sat at the defense table dressed in a dark gray suit, looking frail, silver-haired, and quiet, presenting an image of an innocent, elderly grandfather falsely accused of an ancient crime. His high-priced defense team attempted to attack the validity of the touch DNA evidence, arguing that microscopic biological material could have been transferred to the teacup through innocent secondary contact or family gatherings prior to the murder. They claimed that identical twins share living spaces and personal items, making it impossible to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Daniel's DNA on the teacup was deposited on the exact morning of the homicide. However, the prosecution's case was an impenetrable fortress built upon cutting-edge genomic science and undeniable physical proof. Lead prosecutor Margaret Vance, no relation to the defendant, called the state's chief geneticist to the witness stand, who demonstrated to the jury how ultra-deep whole genome sequencing identified 3 specific somatic point mutations present on the teacup and in Daniel's DNA that were completely absent in David's genetic code. The defense's transfer argument crumbled further when prosecutors presented the surgical trocar recovered from Daniel's hidden wall safe, featuring microscopic trace residue that returned a positive match for David Vance's preserved blood proteins after 35 years in storage. The emotional climax of the trial occurred on the 7th day, when prosecutors displayed a high-definition 3D digital reconstruction of the crime scene, overlaying the financial ledger entries with the exact time of the murder. The jury watched in spellbound horror as the evidence demonstrated how Daniel had planned the execution down to the minute, executed his twin brother in cold blood for money, and used his identical face to blend into the shadows of society for over 3 decades. Daniel maintained a stone-faced, emotionless expression throughout the horrifying presentation, staring straight ahead at the courtroom wall as if he were completely detached from the reality of his own trial. During closing arguments, prosecutor Margaret Vance stood directly in front of the jury box, holding up the antique surgical trocar in a clear evidence bag, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom with chilling authority. For 35 years, the defendant believed he had committed the perfect crime, she stated passionately. He believed that sharing his brother's face and sharing his brother's DNA made him invisible to the law. But he forgot one fundamental truth: science evolves, truth endures, and no matter how many years pass, the blood of an innocent man cries out from the earth for justice. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom with a swift, unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. A quiet gasp rippled through the gallery as the verdict was read aloud, followed by soft tears from former students and community members who had waited 35 years to see David Vance's killer brought to justice. The judge sentenced 77-year-old Daniel Vance to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that the man who executed his twin brother for greed would spend the remainder of his natural life behind the cold steel bars of a maximum security state facility.
Part 6.
The conviction of Daniel Vance brought an explosive sense of relief and closure to Knox County, but the dark echoes of the 1989 murder continued to reverberate through the legal and scientific communities worldwide. The successful prosecution marked a monumental milestone in the history of forensic science, representing the first time in global legal history that ultra-deep whole genome sequencing of somatic point mutations was successfully used to convict an identical twin of first-degree murder. Legal experts and forensic scientists praised the extraordinary work of Detective Karen Mercer and the Ohio BCI, hailing the case as a masterclass in modern cold case investigation that proved no killer, no matter how clever or genetically identical, was beyond the reach of modern justice. In the weeks following the trial, the Knox County Sheriff's Office officially closed the case file labeled Vance, David 1989, stamping the cover with a bold, bright red stamp that read, "Solved." Detective Mercer personally carried the original file down to the basement storage room, placing it back on the shelf where it had sat gathering dust for 35 years, but this time, it was a symbol of absolute triumph over time, deceit, and evil. The rural community that had lived under a cloud of fear and suspicion for decades could finally breathe a collective sigh of relief, knowing that the phantom killer was not a stranger lurking in the dark, but a greedy brother who is now safely locked away forever. A memorial garden was established by the local school district on the grounds of the high school where David Vance had taught biology, featuring a stone monument engraved with his name and a quote about the eternal power of truth. Former students, now middle-aged adults with families of their own, gathered at the dedication ceremony to honor the memory of a teacher whose life had been tragically stolen at 32 years old. They spoke of David's kindness, his passion for science, and his unwavering dedication to his students, a stark, beautiful contrast to the dark, greedy legacy of the twin brother who tried to erase him from existence. Meanwhile, 77-year-old Daniel Vance was transported under armed guard to the Grafton Correctional Institution in Lorain County, Ohio, to begin serving his life sentence among the state's most dangerous felons. Stripped of his wealth, his luxury home, his country club standing, and his freedom, he was assigned a standard steel-walled cell, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit that erased every trace of his former prestige. Prison guards reported that Daniel remained completely silent in his cell, refusing interviews with journalists, declining visits from former acquaintances, and staring silently out his narrow barred window at the cold Ohio sky as the days turned into months. As another late autumn wind swept across the cornfields of Knox County, dusting the rural highways in a soft layer of fallen leaves, the old Vance farmhouse stood quiet and serene under the gray sky. The porch light, which had burned every single night for 35 years as a symbol of fear and vigilance, was finally turned off by the new owners, replaced by the warm, peaceful glow of a home that was no longer haunted by an unsolved horror. The long, dark nightmare that began on a crisp morning in October 1989 was finally over, and the memory of David Vance was restored to the light of truth and justice.
Part 7.
The ripple effects of the Daniel Vance conviction transformed the landscape of law enforcement across the state of Ohio, prompting the creation of a specialized, state-funded cold case genomic task force headed by Detective Karen Mercer. Inspired by the breakthrough in the Vance investigation, police departments across the nation began re-examining hundreds of dormant cold cases involving identical twins, complex DNA mixtures, and degraded biological evidence that had previously been deemed unsolvable by traditional methods. The cardboard boxes sitting in cold storage rooms in precincts across the country were no longer seen as dead-end archives, but as treasure troves of microscopic truth waiting for the right scientific key to unlock them. Inside the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, the specialized ultra-deep genomic sequencing protocol developed for the Vance trial was officially codified into standard operating procedure, dubbed the Vance Protocol. Forensic geneticists from international agencies, including Scotland Yard, Interpol, and the Australian Federal Police, traveled to Columbus to study the methodology, eager to implement the cutting-edge technology in their own long-dormant homicide investigations. The cold-blooded crime committed in a small, rural Ohio mudroom in 1989 had inadvertently sparked a global revolution in forensic genetics, ensuring that future generations of killers could no longer hide behind biological anomalies or identical genetics. For Detective Mercer, the resolution of the case brought a profound sense of professional fulfillment, but it also left an indelible, haunting impression on her perception of human nature. In her desk drawer at the precinct, she kept a small, framed photograph of the ceramic teacup recovered from the 1989 crime scene, a constant reminder that the most terrifying evil often wears a face that is familiar, loving, and genetically identical to our own. It served as a stark lesson that no matter how meticulously a crime is planned, no matter how thoroughly a killer cleans a crime scene, the human body leaves behind an indelible, microscopic signature that time cannot erase. In the spring of 2025, less than a year after his conviction, Daniel Vance suffered a fatal stroke in the infirmary of the Grafton Correctional Institution, dying alone at 78 years old without ever uttering a single word of confession, apology, or remorse for the execution of his twin brother. His death marked the absolute physical end of the Vance bloodline, closing the final chapter on a dark family tragedy that had spanned nearly 4 decades. He was buried in an unmarked state grave far away from the Knox County Cemetery, where his brother David rested in peace beneath a flower-draped headstone. The story of the Ohio 1989 cold case solved by revolutionary science became a permanent legend in the annals of American true crime, cited in legal textbooks, true crime documentaries, and scientific journals as the ultimate proof that justice has no expiration date. The rural highways of Knox County returned to their quiet, timeless rhythm. The cornfields grew tall and green under the summer sun, and the farmhouses stood peaceful against the horizon. The dark shadow that had hung over the community for 35 years was completely gone, replaced by the enduring, unshakable truth that light will always pierce the deepest dark. Part 8. The legacy of the Vance murder case continued to influence the evolution of criminal justice well into the late 2020s, serving as a beacon of hope for families of cold case victims nationwide who had waited decades for answers. The Knox County Courthouse, where the dramatic trial unfolded, established an annual lecture series dedicated to forensic ethics and cold case innovation, attracting top legal minds, forensic scientists, and law enforcement officers from around the world. The small mudroom in the rural farmhouse where David Vance drew his last breath was eventually renovated, but the story of what happened there remained burned into the historical fabric of the county as a reminder of the fragility of life and the ultimate triumph of justice. In local high schools across central Ohio, biology teachers began incorporating the Vance protocol into their genetics curricula, teaching young students how somatic mutations occur at a cellular level and how those tiny genetic variations were used to catch a killer 35 years after a crime. David Vance's passion for science lived on through the very curriculum inspired by his tragic death, educating thousands of young minds on the incredible power of molecular biology. His memory was no longer defined by the horrific violence of his death, but by the revolutionary scientific legacy that emerged from the dark. Detective Karen Mercer was awarded the Ohio Distinguished Law Enforcement Medal of Honor for her extraordinary leadership, relentless determination, and pioneering use of forensic genealogy in solving the 1989 cold case. During her acceptance speech before a crowded auditorium of state officials and law enforcement leaders, she dedicated the award to the memory of David Vance and to all the forgotten victims of cold cases whose files were still sitting in dark storage rooms waiting for their day in the light. She reminded the audience that every cold case file represents a human life, a grieving family, and a promise that law enforcement must never abandon, no matter how many years or decades pass. As autumn arrived once again in central Ohio, casting a brilliant crimson and gold glow over the rolling hills of Knox County, a quiet peace rested over the rural township. The farm roads were filled with the sound of rustling corn leaves, passing tractors, and the cheerful laughter of children playing in farmyards, a vibrant, beautiful symphony of rural American life. The dark, terrifying mystery that had haunted the community for 35 years was completely resolved, leaving behind a legacy of healing, scientific progress, and absolute justice. The headline that had shocked the nation, Ohio 1989 cold case solved, twin brother arrested after 35 years, was now a permanent chapter in the history of crime fighting, a story that proved no crime is ever truly perfect, no killer is untouchable, and no lie can withstand the relentless march of truth. The cold case was closed, the phantom was unmasked, and the memory of David Vance was forever secured in the eternal light of justice. Part 9. The historical impact of the Vance investigation reached far beyond the borders of Ohio, sparking federal legislation aimed at providing dedicated funding for cold case DNA retesting across all 50 states. The David Vance Cold Case Justice Act was signed into federal law, allocating hundreds of millions of dollars to state and local police departments to digitize old evidence, perform advanced genomic sequencing, and utilize genetic genealogy on long-dormant homicide cases. Because of a single ceramic teacup preserved in a cardboard box in 1989, thousands of forgotten cold cases across America were given a second chance at resolution, bringing long-awaited answers and peace to countless grieving families. Forensic laboratories across the world began implementing mandatory protocols for preserving low-copy number touch DNA from crime scene evidence, ensuring that even the most microscopic biological traces collected by officers would be stored in climate-controlled conditions for future scientific analysis. The mistake made by killers in the 1980s and 1990s, believing that leaving no fingerprints or bloodstains meant leaving no evidence, was exposed as a fatal flaw in their calculations. The invisible world of cellular biology had become the ultimate weapon against injustice, transforming the smallest skin cell into a voice that could speak from the grave. In Knox County, the memory of the 1989 murder shifted from a story of terror to a story of collective resilience and scientific triumph. Old residents who had lived through the terrifying months following the murder shared the story with younger generations not to instill fear, but to teach them about the importance of truth, community, and the unshakable dedication of law enforcement officers who refused to give up on a cold case. The fear that had once locked farm doors and lit up porch lights was replaced by a deep, enduring pride in their community's role in changing the history of forensic science. Detective Karen Mercer, after a long and distinguished career that saw her solve dozens of dormant homicides using advanced genetic tools, eventually retired from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. On her final day in office, she walked down to the evidence storage room one last time, looking at the long rows of organized boxes containing resolved cases. She paused before the shelf holding the Vance file, placing her hand gently on the box that had started a national revolution in forensic genetics, knowing that her life's work had made the world a safer, more just place for everyone. The sun set slowly over the quiet countryside of Knox County, casting long, golden rays across the peaceful fields and winding country roads. The evening air was cool and fresh, carrying the familiar sense of autumn earth, wood smoke, and dry leaves. The farmhouse where David Vance had lived sat quiet under the twilight sky, its windows reflecting the warm, soft colors of the sunset, a silent, enduring symbol of a tragedy that was met with relentless truth, a mystery that was solved, and a justice that was finally, completely delivered.
Part 10.
The passage of time continued its gentle, uninterrupted march over central Ohio, but the story of David and Daniel Vance remained forever etched into the folklore of American justice. The forensic protocol birthed from the 1989 cold case continued to solve complex, high-profile homicides across the globe, unmasking serial killers, rapists, and covert criminals who had spent decades living among society under false pretenses. The invisible thread of DNA, once a secret locked deep within the human cell, had become an unyielding, unbreakable chain that bound evil men to their past crimes no matter how far they ran or how long they hid. In the legal community, the Vance trial became a mandatory case study in law school textbooks, cited as the definitive precedent for introducing whole genome sequencing and somatic mutation analysis into modern courtrooms. It challenged future generations of prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges to embrace scientific innovation while maintaining the highest standards of constitutional due process and evidentiary integrity. The trial demonstrated that when science and law work in perfect harmony, the truth can penetrate even the most sophisticated, identical deceptions. In the quiet cemetery in Knox County where David Vance lay buried, flowers were continually placed on his headstone by community members, former students, and strangers who had been moved by his story. The inscription on his monument, carved deep into gray granite, read, "In memory of David Vance, a dedicated educator whose truth shone through the dark." It was a peaceful, sacred place where visitors could sit in quiet reflection, surrounded by the rustling oak trees and the gentle Midwestern breeze, remembering a good man whose life had changed the world long after he was gone. The news headline that had once flashed across television screens in October 2024, Ohio 1989 cold case solved, twin brother arrested after 35 years, was no longer a sensational breaking news flash, but a monumental milestone in the long history of crime fighting. It stood as a permanent testament to the relentless human spirit that refuses to let the innocent be forgotten, the scientific brilliance that unlocks the deepest mysteries of the universe, and the eternal truth that justice will always find a way home. As night fell over Knox County, the stars appeared one by one in the vast, clear Ohio sky, glittering like tiny diamonds over the peaceful farmhouses, the winding roads, and the quiet cornfields below. The darkness held no more fear, no more phantom killers, and no more unsolved secrets. The quiet rural township rested in absolute, enduring peace, wrapped in the warm, unshakable light of truth, justice, and eternal closure. Part 11. The snow began to fall softly over Knox County in the late evening hours of December 2026, blanketing the rolling hills, the bare oak branches, and the quiet farmhouses in a pristine, shimmering coat of white. Standing at the window of her quiet home overlooking the snowy valley, retired Detective Karen Mercer watched the snowflakes dance in the warm glow of the street lamp outside. The countryside was completely still, silent, and at peace, a breathtaking, tranquil landscape that seemed miles away from the dark, terrifying horror that had gripped this same valley 37 years ago. She thought about the long, winding journey that had brought her to the cardboard box labeled Vance, David, 1989, remembering the smell of the old paper, the black and white crime scene photos, and the tiny ceramic teacup that held the microscopic key to a 35-year-old murder. She remembered the intense pressure, the grueling hours in the lab, and the incredible, heart-stopping moment when the computer screen flashed with 3 microscopic somatic mutations that separated a ruthless killer from his innocent, identical twin. It was a journey that had tested the limits of human technology, legal ethics, and personal determination, but it had ended in absolute, undeniable victory for the truth. The story of the Vance twins was a timeless, haunting tale of human nature at its absolute best and absolute worst, a story of a humble teacher who dedicated his life to educating others and a greedy brother who destroyed his own soul for money and vanity. It showed how jealousy and greed can poison the closest biological bond in human existence, driving a man to execute his own flesh and blood in cold blood. But more importantly, it demonstrated that no matter how deep the greed, no matter how clever the killer, the natural order of the universe leans inexorably toward justice and truth. The legacy of the case lived on in every cold case file currently being pulled from storage rooms across the nation, in every laboratory where geneticists scan DNA strands for microscopic answers, and in every courtroom where science spoke for those who could no longer speak for themselves. The memory of David Vance was no longer a symbol of an unsolved horror, but a guiding light for thousands of investigators working tirelessly to bring answers to grieving families who had waited in the dark for far too long. As the midnight hour approached, the snow covered the gravel lane leading to the old farmhouse on Highway 36, smoothing over every footprint, every tire track, and every scar on the land until everything was pure, clean, and white. The porch light on the farmhouse was dark, no longer needed to ward off the phantoms of the past, because the phantom had been named, tried, and buried. The darkness of October 1989 had finally, completely given way to the light, and the quiet rural valley rested in the deep, everlasting peace of a cold case finally, perfectly solved. The heavy winter snowfall of December 2026 melted into a dense, lingering fog that blanketed the valleys of Knox County throughout early 2027. At the state forensic headquarters in Columbus, the administrative files detailing the scientific breakthroughs of the David Vance homicide were being organized into permanent state legal archives. While the criminal trial of Daniel Vance had concluded with a life sentence and his subsequent death in prison had brought a physical end to the perpetrator, the broader implications of the case continued to ripple through the American legal system. The successful extraction and court admission of somatic point mutations to differentiate identical twins had established an unprecedented legal benchmark, prompting state attorney generals across the Midwest to review decades of ambiguous forensic rulings. In her home office overlooking the misty countryside, retired Detective Karen Mercer sat before a desktop terminal connected to the newly established Cold Case Genomic Registry, a secure national database created under the David Vance Cold Case Justice Act. Though she had officially stepped down from active law enforcement duty, her role as an executive advisor to the State Forensic Board required her to review complex, multi-jurisdictional cold case petitions seeking high-depth genomic sequencing support. Her screen displayed a list of dormant cases spanning 4 decades, each entry representing a frozen moment in time, a vanished student, an unidentified highway victim, a rural home invasion that had stumped local deputies in the late 20th century. As Mercer cycled through the digitized evidence logs, her eyes stopped on an old cross-reference filing attached to the original 1989 Knox County investigation. During the initial 1989 sweep of David Vance's farmhouse, local deputies had documented a secondary physical detail that had been glossed over in the chaotic search for a murder weapon, a faint, circular indentation pressed into the damp soil beneath a heavy oak workbench inside David's detached woodworking barn. In 1989, investigators had assumed the mark was left by a standard oil drum or a piece of heavy farm machinery. However, when viewed through a modern spatial reconstruction model created during the 2024 trial preparations, the dimensions of the indentation matched the precise base footprint of a commercial-grade portable hydraulic press, a specialized tool used in the late 1980s by industrial medical suppliers to calibrate high-pressure surgical instruments. A quiet, familiar tension settled over Mercer as she opened the archived crime scene photos of the detached barn. Daniel Vance's Dublin-based medical supply firm had maintained a specialized equipment division in the late 1980s, importing heavy precision machinery from manufacturers in West Germany. The presence of a commercial hydraulic press on David's secluded rural property weeks before his death suggested a dark possibility that had never been fully explored during the 2024 murder trial. David Vance may not have been a completely passive, unsuspecting victim caught off guard by a sudden inheritance plot. He may have been actively assisting his twin brother in modifying or testing specialized medical components on his farm without understanding the lethal purpose those tools were being engineered to serve. Mercer contacted the current lead investigator at the Knox County Sheriff's Office, requesting permission to conduct a non-invasive ground-penetrating radar sweep of the floor beneath the old woodworking barn. Though the murder case was legally solved and closed under the red stamp of conviction, the pursuit of absolute historical truth remained an unyielding priority. Accompanied by a junior forensic technician, Mercer returned to the quiet property on Highway 36, stepping inside the dark, dry timber structure that had stood untouched for nearly 4 decades. The technician pushed the high-frequency radar array across the packed dirt floor, scanning the subsurface layers down to a depth of 6 feet. The digital readout on the portable monitor flared with a sharp density contrast situated directly beneath the area where the old oak workbench had once stood. Buried 3 feet below the dirt surface was a small, rectangular metallic object measuring 12 inches by 6 inches, encased inside a heavy layer of degraded rubberized waterproofing. With the property owner's consent, the technician carefully excavated the packed soil, retrieving a rusted, heavy steel storage box sealed with industrial silicone. Inside the box lay a secondary set of handwritten journals, several uncancelled bank checks drawn on a private account in Toronto, and a series of technical schematics drawn in Daniel Vance's distinct, precise handwriting dated August 1989, 2 months before the murder. The schematics detailed custom modifications for surgical trocars, featuring precise measurements for reducing external tissue resistance and eliminating back pressure during rapid arterial punctures. The contents of the buried steel box revealed the final, tragic layer of deception that had taken 38 years to come to light. David Vance had not merely been targeted for a sudden inheritance trust. He had discovered his twin brother's illicit manufacturing of unregistered, modified medical instruments for black market veterinary and surgical suppliers. David had used his background in biology to analyze the tools, realizing that Daniel was producing lethal, uninspected medical devices that posed a catastrophic danger to patients and practitioners alike. David had hidden the modified prototypes and technical schematics on his farm, threatening to turn the evidence over to the Federal Food and Drug Administration if Daniel did not immediately cease operations. The execution on the morning of October 12, 1989, was not just an act of cold-blooded financial greed. It was a desperate, surgical strike to silence a brother who had uncovered a massive criminal enterprise that would have destroyed Daniel's business empire and sent him to federal prison in his early 30s. Daniel had executed his twin brother, searched the house for the hidden schematics, failed to locate the buried box beneath the barn floor, and spent 35 years living in constant, secret dread that a new owner would dig up the dirt and expose his dual life to the world. Mercer held the yellowed technical schematics in her gloved hands, watching the cold spring rain fall over the fields of Knox County outside the open barn door. The conviction of Daniel Vance in 2024 had delivered legal justice, satisfying the jury, the court, and the public memory with a clear motive and an indisputable DNA match. But the buried box proved that reality is always deeper, colder, and far more complex than the neat narratives constructed inside a courtroom. She logged the newly discovered artifacts into the Permanent State Historical Archive, attaching them to the master file of the David Vance investigation. The murder was solved, the perpetrator was dead, and every hidden secret buried beneath the dirt of Knox County had finally been brought out into the clean, uncompromising light of truth. As Mercer drove back toward Columbus, the overcast sky parted slightly over the rural highway, allowing a pale, golden shaft of sunlight to illuminate the quiet farm fields, marking a final, peaceful close to the most complex forensic chapter in Ohio history. The rain that swept across the central Ohio farmlands in late spring 2027 carried a cold, heavy moisture that clung to the freshly plowed fields of Knox County. At the Ohio State Highway Patrol Academy in Columbus, the newly expanded Forensic Science Training Center was dedicating a state-of-the-art laboratory wing to the study of trace physical evidence in historical homicides. The dedication ceremony brought together veteran homicide investigators, molecular geneticists, and legal scholars from across the Midwest, all assembled to honor the investigative legacy created by the resolution of the David Vance case. Yet, even as public speeches praised the flawless execution of the Vance Protocol, the administrative processing of physical artifacts recovered from the buried steel box behind David's old woodworking barn continued to uncover secondary forensic mysteries that challenged the original boundaries of the trial. Inside a secure archival vault at the State Crime Laboratory, retired Detective Karen Mercer worked alongside senior forensic archivist Dr. Raymond Vance, no relation to the victim, but a leading specialist in late 20th century paper restoration and chemical trace analysis. On their workstation sat the original, water-damaged journals retrieved from the rubberized box buried 3 feet beneath the dirt floor of the barn. While the grand jury in 2024 had focused primarily on the technical schematics detailing modified surgical trocars, the secondary paper volumes contained dozens of tightly packed, handwritten pages written in an encrypted numerical shorthand. The shorthand had been utilized by David Vance during his tenure as a high school biology teacher to record private, uncatalogued field observations, experimental chemical compound notes, and daily financial logs. Using high-resolution multispectral imaging and deep ultraviolet luminescence, Dr. Raymond Vance succeeded in digitalizing the faded graphite entries on the degraded pages, revealing a series of entries dated between June and September of 1989. The entries did not detail a passive discovery of illegal medical equipment. They documented a deliberate, clandestine counter-investigation conducted by David Vance into a regional medical supply network that extended far beyond his brother's Dublin-based company. David had systematically tracked shipments of veterinary sedatives, industrial surgical instruments, and specialized chemical reagents originating from pharmaceutical warehouses in West Berlin, Toronto, and Chicago, mapping their transit routes through rural Ohio distribution hubs. The digitized pages revealed that Daniel Vance had not been operating as an isolated rogue business owner attempting to stave off bankruptcy. He was acting as a primary Midwestern logistics node for an illicit international syndicate that specialized in providing unverified, highly dangerous medical hardware and controlled chemical compounds to black market surgical clinics, unsanctioned veterinary operations, and private biological research outfits operating entirely outside federal oversight. David Vance had utilized his scientific expertise to analyze sample compounds brought to his farm, realizing that the network was distributing contaminated, high-potency synthetic reagents capable of causing catastrophic organ failure or instant cardiac arrest without leaving traceable chemical signatures in standard post-mortem toxicology screens. As Mercer read the decrypted transcripts on her monitor, the terrifying scope of David's moral burden came into sharp focus. David had not merely confronted his twin brother over an inheritance trust or a simple financial dispute. He had discovered a widespread, lethal enterprise operating in the shadows of the American Midwest. In the final journal entry, dated October 10, 1989, 48 hours before his murder, David wrote in clear, unencrypted ink, "The medical supply entries do not align with legal clinical permits. Daniel has allowed his infrastructure to be used by entities that manufacture silence. If I deliver these ledgers to the federal authorities in Cleveland on Friday, the network will collapse, but it will take both of our names down with it." The realization hit Mercer like an icy draft through an open window. The execution on the morning of October 12, 1989, had not been a sudden, panicked response to a domestic dispute over a farm or a family trust. It was a preemptive, high-stakes tactical elimination executed to prevent the imminent collapse of an international black market medical syndicate. Daniel Vance had walked into his brother's mudroom, drank chamomile tea, and delivered a lethal strike with a surgical trocar because his handlers within the syndicate had made it abundantly clear that if David delivered those journals to federal prosecutors, both twin brothers would be eliminated before the sun set. Mercer immediately arranged a secure conference with Special Agent Marcus Vance of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Criminal Investigative Division in Cincinnati. The meeting took place inside a private briefing room at the federal building, far removed from local police precincts and media outlets. Agent Vance reviewed the decrypted journal entries, the Toronto bank drafts, and the international shipping manifests with a stoic, analytical focus, confirming that federal authorities in the late 1980s had indeed conducted a covert, unpublicized inquiry into black market medical supply lines operating out of the Great Lakes region, an inquiry that had abruptly gone cold following the sudden death of David Vance and the total disappearance of his private journals. The federal files, unsealed under high-level security clearance, revealed that following the 1989 murder, Daniel Vance had immediately liquidated several primary distribution warehouses in Toronto and Chicago, transferring millions of dollars through untraceable offshore accounts before settling into his quiet, respectable life as a suburban pharmaceutical manager in Dublin, Ohio. He had lived for 35 years not merely as a killer who had gotten away with murder, but as a retired operative who had successfully protected an entire shadow industry from federal prosecution by sacrificing his identical twin brother on the altar of absolute silence. The discovery provided the final, definitive historical context to a case that had already rewritten the rules of forensic science. The public narrative established by the 2024 trial, Ohio 1989 cold case solved, twin brother arrested after 35 years, remained a brilliant, unquestioned triumph of touch DNA extraction, whole genome sequencing, and state law enforcement determination. The jury had reached the correct verdict, the killer had been sentenced to life in prison, and the physical perpetrator had died in a state facility. The public had been given justice, the community had achieved closure, and the memory of David Vance had been honored as an innocent, beloved teacher. Yet, as Karen Mercer locked the decrypted journal transcripts into the permanent federal archive safe alongside the antique brass keys, the surgical trocars, and the touch DNA profiles, she understood the ultimate, sobering reality of major criminal investigations. The courtroom delivers legal verdicts bounded by physical proof, immediate motives, and individual culprits who can be brought to the bar of justice. But beneath the surface of solved cold cases lies a deeper, vast historical reality, a world of hidden networks, complex sacrifices, and silent truths that time may expose, but can never fully erase from the cold earth of history. Mercer walked out of the federal building into the cool, rain-slicked afternoon air of Columbus, looking up at the gray, overcast sky that stretched across the Ohio horizon. The cornfields of Knox County were quiet, the farm roads were peaceful, and the long shadow of October 1989 had finally receded into absolute clarity. The cold case was solved in the eyes of the law, the memory of David Vance was restored to absolute honor, and the truth, in all its complex, terrifying grandeur, rested safe and complete in the eternal light of justice. Part 14. The lingering mist of late spring 2027 gave way to a hot, oppressive summer heat across central Ohio, heavy with humidity that hung low over the cornfields of Knox County. At the federal building in Cincinnati, the Joint Task Force assigned to archive and analyze the vast, unrecorded distribution network connected to the late Daniel Vance was entering its final operational phase. Retired Detective Karen Mercer sat inside a quiet, air-conditioned conference room on the 5th floor, surrounded by high-resolution digital monitors displaying regional transit maps, historical financial audits, and multi-state medical licensing registries spanning from 1980 through 1990. Although the criminal trial had concluded with a guilty verdict, the perpetrator was deceased, and the public narrative was cemented. Ohio 1989 cold case solved. Twin brother arrested after 35 years. The administrative and historical duties of law enforcement demanded a complete, uncompromising accounting of the infrastructure that had enabled the crime. The public record belonged to the jury's verdict and the news headlines, but the deep historical truth belonged to the archives. Mercer, alongside Special Agent Marcus Vance of the FBI, spent long, grueling hours mapping out the secondary channels through which modified medical hardware and unregistered chemical compounds had flowed prior to David Vance's murder in October 1989. As Mercer cross-referenced the decrypted journal entries retrieved from the buried box in Knox County against declassified shipping manifests from the Port of Cleveland, a striking, unexamined geographic coordinate emerged. In July 1989, 3 months before his execution, David Vance had made 4 uncharacteristic, documented trips to a quiet, rural township in neighboring Richland County, just 20 miles north of his farmhouse. Municipal property deeds from 1989 revealed that a modest, abandoned grain silo complex situated along a defunct rail line had been acquired by a real estate holding firm registered under a fictitious name, an entity whose corporate filings matched the exact offshore bank accounts used by Daniel Vance to process international wire transfers. Mercer called up the spatial telemetry scans of the Richland County property. The grain silo complex had sat abandoned for over 3 decades, surrounded by dense brush and forgotten by local utility companies. However, modern thermal and electrical grid analysis conducted by federal agents revealed that a low-voltage underground power conduit, tapping into a regional industrial line, was still actively drawing power to the site. The facility was not a dead relic of the agricultural past. It was a dormant, automated logistics node that had remained powered and pressurized long after Daniel Vance was led away in handcuffs. Accompanied by Special Agent Marcus Vance and a specialized team of federal evidence technicians, Mercer drove north along Highway 13 toward the Richland County line as the late afternoon sun burned crimson through the summer haze. The silo complex stood shadowed against the treeline, a towering concrete structure covered in rusted iron ladders and choked with wild ivy. The main entrance was sealed with a heavy, reinforced steel security door equipped with a dual locking mechanism that required both a physical key and a mechanical combination. Mercer retrieved the key set recovered from Daniel Vance's private safe in Dublin, fitting the second antique key into the cylinder, while Agent Vance entered the numerical sequence decoded from David's encrypted journal. With a heavy, metallic groan that echoed through the quiet countryside, the steel door unlocked, releasing a rush of dry, cool, nitrogen-preserved air from the interior. The air inside carried no moisture, no dust, and no scent of decay. It was a pristine, climate-controlled vault preserved in absolute stasis beneath the concrete shell of an old agricultural silo. The team stepped inside, their tactical lights cutting through the darkness to illuminate a multi-level subterranean facility carved into the limestone bedrock beneath the silo floor. The upper level housed rows of heavy steel storage lockers, industrial vacuum sealing equipment, and specialized transport cases stamped with international maritime symbols. The facility was an unmapped, Midwestern staging depot, a blind spot where international shipments of medical hardware and specialized chemical compounds had been received, inspected, repackaged, and dispatched across the region without ever appearing on state health department registries or federal customs manifests. In the center of the vault's lower floor stood a heavy oak desk, untouched since 1989, covered in a thin, uniform layer of desiccated dust. Resting upon the blotter was a final, unposted parcel wrapped in heavy brown paper, addressed to a federal prosecutor's office in Cleveland, stamped with an express delivery tag dated October 11, 1989, the day before David Vance was murdered. Beside the parcel lay David's personal brass signet ring and a small, handwritten index card written in his clear, familiar handwriting. The proof is housed here. If I do not return by noon on Friday, open Vault 04. The realization settled over the team with a quiet, devastating weight. David Vance had not merely planned to report his brother to federal authorities. He had constructed a master trap inside the Richland County silo, gathering physical samples, shipping manifests, and financial records into a single, undeniable package. On the morning of October 12, 1989, David had invited Daniel to his farmhouse, offering him one final opportunity to turn himself in and dismantle the network voluntarily before the parcel was dispatched to Cleveland. Daniel had responded not with repentance or fear, but with a surgical trocar to his twin brother's heart. Following the murder, Daniel had searched the farmhouse in a panic, failing to find the key to the Richland County facility or the buried box beneath the woodworking barn. Fearing that searching the silo site would draw immediate law enforcement scrutiny to the property, Daniel had locked the facility's perimeter, maintained the underground power payments through automated offshore accounts, and spent 35 years praying that the reinforced vault would remain forgotten in the woods of Richland County forever. Special Agent Marcus Vance carefully documented the unopened parcel, securing it in a heavy, tamper-evident federal transport container. The contents of the parcel, containing original distribution ledgers, modified equipment components, and sworn affidavits prepared by David Vance 38 years earlier, provided the absolute, unassailable historical completion to the federal investigation into the 1980s black market medical network. Every loose thread had been gathered, every shadow illuminated, and every secret brought into the light. The team stepped back out into the humid summer twilight, securing the heavy steel door of the silo behind them. The quiet countryside of central Ohio stretched out under a sky painted in shades of deep indigo and gold, peaceful, silent, and serene. The long, complex nightmare that had begun on a crisp autumn morning in 1989 had finally reached its ultimate, absolute conclusion. As Karen Mercer stood at the edge of the property, watching the federal vehicles prepare for the return trip to Columbus, she felt a profound, overwhelming sense of stillness. The public narrative, Ohio 1989 cold case solved, twin brother arrested after 35 years, remained a shining monument to the power of modern forensic science, touch DNA, and legal justice. It had satisfied the jury, comforted the community, and put a killer in a state prison cell until his dying breath. But here, beneath the quiet fields of Richland County, the deeper truth of David Vance's ultimate sacrifice was forever preserved. He was not merely a victim who had been caught off guard in his own mudroom. He was a man of uncompromising moral courage who had laid his life on the line to protect others from a shadow industry, leaving behind a trail of truth that neither time, nor greed, nor murder could ever erase. Mercer got into her car, started the engine, and drove down the quiet rural road, leaving the past behind in the eternal, unshakable light of justice. The intense heat of July 2027 gradually yielded to the subtle, cool breezes of early autumn across central Ohio, bringing a quiet rustle to the ripening cornfields of Knox County. At the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation headquarters in London, Ohio, the digital and physical repositories for the state's historical homicide cases were undergoing a comprehensive systems audit. Retired Detective Karen Mercer sat inside a quiet research alcove on the facility's second floor, reviewing the final, digitized master file of the David Vance investigation. On her terminal screen, the decades-long timeline was mapped in precise, chronological detail, from the initial horror of October 12, 1989, to the revolutionary genomic breakthrough of 2024, the conviction and death of Daniel Vance, and the subsequent recovery of the secondary vaults hidden beneath the farmlands. While the legal, judicial, and federal investigations were officially concluded, Mercer's analytical mind remained engaged by a final, subtle anomaly present in the financial records recovered from the Richland County grain silo vault. Among the digitized bank ledgers detailing Daniel Vance's offshore transactions from 1985 through 1989, there was a series of small, automated monthly wire transfers directed to a modest credit union in Mount Vernon, Ohio, the county seat of Knox County. The recipient account was registered under a historical trust established in 1965 by David and Daniel Vance's late mother, a trust originally created to fund educational scholarships for rural students in Knox County. Mercer pulled up the complete transaction history of the scholarship trust, which had operated continuously and quietly for over 60 years. Following David Vance's death in 1989, the trust had not dissolved, nor had it been absorbed into Daniel Vance's private assets. Instead, it had continued to disperse annual academic grants to high school graduates pursuing degrees in biological sciences, veterinary medicine, and chemistry at universities across Ohio. Every single grant had been funded through the automated wire transfers originating from Daniel's offshore accounts, masquerading as anonymous alumni donations. A strange, complex picture began to take shape as Mercer analyzed the list of grant recipients spanning from 1990 to 2024. Over 34 years, more than 40 young men and women from rural Ohio had completed their scientific educations through the trust, many going on to achieve prominent careers in public health, forensic medicine, and molecular biology. Daniel Vance had executed his identical twin brother in cold blood for financial gain and to protect a lethal black market supply network. Yet, throughout those same 34 years, he had used a portion of his illicit fortune to quietly finance the scientific educations of the next generation in his brother's honor. Mercer arranged a final meeting with the current administrator of the Mount Vernon Credit Union, an elderly local attorney who had managed the scholarship trust since the late 1970s. The meeting took place in a small, wood-paneled office overlooking the historical town square of Mount Vernon. The attorney, holding a thick folder of yellowed administrative correspondence, confirmed that the anonymous donations had arrived with absolute regularity on the first business day of every month, accompanied by a typed letter containing a single instruction: to be awarded strictly based on academic merit in the natural sciences, in memory of David Vance. The attorney revealed a final document retrieved from a secure safety deposit box, a sealed letter delivered to the bank in November 1989, 1 month after David's murder, bearing Daniel Vance's signature and notarized in Columbus. The letter contained explicit legal instructions that upon Daniel's death or permanent incapacity, the remaining assets of the offshore trust were to be irrevocably transferred to the Ohio State University Department of Molecular Genetics to establish a permanent research endowment in forensic biology named after David Vance. Mercer held the notarized letter in her hands, looking out the window at the quiet autumn afternoon in Mount Vernon. The revelation did not erase the horror of the crime, nor did it soften the cold-blooded reality of the surgical strike executed on the morning of October 12, 1989. Daniel Vance was a murderer who had chosen greed, self-preservation, and violence over the life of his own twin brother. Yet, in the strange, dark labyrinth of human psychology, he had spent 35 years attempting to quiet his own guilt by funding the very science that would eventually expose his identity and bring him to justice. The scientific legacy born from the tragedy had completed a full, profound circle. The touch DNA extraction techniques, the whole genome sequencing protocols, and the somatic mutation analysis that brought down Daniel Vance in 2024 were the direct result of an advancing scientific field supported by researchers who had been educated through the very funds Daniel had funneled into the state's universities. The killer had unwittingly financed the intellectual foundation of his own ultimate downfall. On a crisp October morning in 2027, marking 38 years to the day since David Vance drew his last breath on the mudroom floor of his farmhouse, a small, quiet gathering took place on the lawn of the Knox County Courthouse. Members of the community, former students, law enforcement officers, and state officials gathered around the stone memorial garden dedicated to David Vance. Retired Detective Karen Mercer stood beside Special Agent Marcus Vance and the faculty chair of the Ohio State University Department of Molecular Genetics as the official announcement of the David Vance Endowed Chair in Forensic Genetics was read aloud. The ceremony was free of grandiosity or sensationalism. It was a dignified, peaceful moment of reflection on a case that had transformed the history of American forensic science. The public headline that had once captivated millions across the nation, Ohio 1989 cold case solved, twin brother arrested after 35 years, had faded from the daily news cycles into the permanent history books. It stood as an unyielding testament to the power of truth, the relentless march of scientific progress, and the unbreakable bond of justice that outlasts greed, time, and death. As the gathering dispersed and the quiet autumn afternoon settled over Knox County, Mercer walked slowly through the memorial garden, looking down at the gray granite stone engraved with David Vance's name. The sun broke through the golden autumn leaves overhead, illuminating the crisp, white letters in a warm, gentle light. The long, terrifying dark that had begun in 1989 was completely gone, replaced by an enduring legacy of truth, education, and peace that would inspire generations to come. Mercer turned and walked down the steps of the courthouse, stepping out into the vibrant, beautiful afternoon. The rural farmlands of Knox County stretched out in every direction under the clear blue sky, quiet, serene, and forever free of the phantom that had haunted them for 35 years. The cold case was solved, the truth was complete, and justice rested in absolute, everlasting peace. Part 16. The transition into the late autumn of 2027 brought a crisp, invigorating frost to the rolling hills of Knox County, coating the wide, harvested cornfields in a thin blanket of silver each morning before the sunrise. In the quiet, high-tech archives of the State Forensic Building in Columbus, the final administrative, scientific, and historical documentation regarding the Ohio 1989 cold case was officially digitized, categorized, and cataloged into the state's permanent legal registry. Retired Detective Karen Mercer sat inside a glass-walled conference room overlooking the autumn tree line, reviewing the complete, 24-volume digital master compilation titled State of Ohio vs. Daniel Vance, Forensic Case Study and Historical Records. Although the trial was long concluded, the defendant deceased, the physical evidence properly archived, and the secondary vaults documented, the case had entered a new phase, one of legal precedent and international scientific methodology. The groundbreaking utilization of ultra-deep whole genome sequencing to isolate somatic point mutations between identical twins had transformed the global landscape of criminal forensics. Law enforcement agencies from across the globe regularly requested access to the redacted case files, seeking to apply the Vance Protocol to cold cases involving identical siblings, complex DNA mixtures, and degraded touch DNA samples that had sat dormant in evidence vaults for decades. On her primary monitor, Mercer reviewed a newly submitted interagency report from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Behavioral Science and Forensic Logistics Units. The report focused on the psychological and operational duality of Daniel Vance, a man who had operated simultaneously as a cold-blooded murderer, an international black market logistics facilitator, a wealthy suburban philanthropist, and the anonymous founder of a medical research endowment honoring the very brother he had executed. The FBI profile highlighted the extraordinary, terrifying compartmentalization that allowed Daniel to live 35 years of an immaculate, quiet life in Dublin, Ohio, entirely unbothered by the ghost of the mudroom on Highway 36 until modern science systematically stripped away his anonymity. While reviewing the cross-referenced evidence logs, Mercer's attention was drawn to a single, unverified entry in the original 1989 Knox County Sheriff's property ledger, an item that had been labeled as Item 42B, miscellaneous metallic fixture, and stored in a secondary evidence container. The item had been retrieved from the pocket of David Vance's coat on the morning of the murder, but because it bore no bloodstains, no fingerprints, and no obvious connection to the surgical trocar, original investigators had logged it as a personal keyring component and forgotten about it. Mercer requested the physical evidence container from the central storage vault, opening the sterile plastic seal under the bright fluorescent lighting of the laboratory table. Inside was a small, heavy brass cylinder, approximately 2 inches in length, featuring an intricate set of internal mechanical threads and a small, hand-engraved serial number on its base, 04 KV 1989. The brass cylinder was not a key ring ornament, nor was it a piece of standard farm machinery. It was a custom-machined pressure alignment collar, the missing coupling component designed to connect the modified surgical trocars to the high-pressure, hydraulic calibration press discovered years later beneath the floor of David's woodworking barn. Using high-resolution 3D digital alignment software, Mercer scanned the brass cylinder and overlaid its physical dimensions onto the spatial schematics retrieved from the Richland County grain silo vault. The alignment was absolute. The brass collar was the master safety interlock for the calibration equipment. Without this specific piece attached to the press, the machinery could not be operated to modify or calibrate the surgical trocars without causing a catastrophic pressure failure. The realization brought the final, precise mechanical truth of the morning of October 12, 1989, into crystal-clear focus. When Daniel Vance entered his brother's mudroom under the pretense of drinking chamomile tea, he was not merely seeking to persuade David to remain silent or attempting to locate the hidden ledgers. Daniel was desperately searching for the brass alignment collar that David had removed from the woodworking barn days earlier to render the illegal equipment completely useless. David had physically carried the master collar in his coat pocket, keeping the single piece of hardware that halted his brother's black market manufacturing line. When David refused to surrender the collar, Daniel realized that his entire illegal enterprise was permanently paralyzed, exposing him to catastrophic financial ruin and immediate prosecution from his handlers within the distribution network. The execution with the surgical trocar was an act of cold, desperate finality, a brutal strike delivered to retrieve the collar, silence the witness, and secure the inheritance trust in a single, terrifying stroke. Yet, in his panicked rush to leave the farmhouse and establish his alibi in downtown Columbus, Daniel had checked David's desk and toolboxes, entirely overlooking the deep inner pocket of the heavy winter coat hanging on the mudroom rack where the brass collar sat hidden. Mercer held the cold brass cylinder in her gloved hand, marveling at the quiet, poetic irony that had laid buried inside an evidence container for 38 years. David Vance had successfully disarmed his brother's lethal operation before his death, carrying the disarming mechanism in his pocket as he drew his final breath. Daniel had spent 35 years living in constant fear that the illegal network would be exposed, completely unaware that the single piece of hardware required to operate the calibration press had been sitting in a cardboard box inside the Knox County Sheriff's evidence room the entire time. Mercer logged the 3D spatial analysis of Item 42B into the Master Digital Archive, attaching the final forensic report to the state file. Every single physical artifact, every piece of evidence, every financial transfer, and every hidden motive had been analyzed, verified, and placed into absolute alignment. There were no remaining questions, no lingering ambiguities, and no hidden shadows left unilluminated in the dark history of October 1989. Later that afternoon, Mercer drove out to Knox County, navigating the quiet, familiar rural roads as the late autumn sun cast a deep golden light across the rolling farmland. She pulled her car to the side of Highway 36, standing near the wooden fence line that bordered the old Vance property. The farmhouse was quiet, its windows reflecting the warm hues of the sunset, its chimney drifting a thin trail of wood smoke into the crisp evening air. The property was peaceful, vibrant, and filled with the quiet rhythm of rural life, a stark, beautiful contrast to the dark horror that had once defined its name. She walked down to the small memorial garden at the edge of the township, where the granite monument honoring David Vance stood surrounded by freshly laid autumn wreaths. She stood before the stone in quiet reflection, hearing the gentle rustle of dry oak leaves in the cool breeze that swept through the valley. The headline that had once shocked the world, Ohio 1989 cold case solved, twin brother arrested after 35 years, had fulfilled its ultimate purpose. It was no longer just a sensational story of crime and scientific triumph. It was an enduring monument to the power of truth, the persistence of justice, and the quiet, invincible dignity of a good man whose memory could never be erased. Mercer placed her hand gently against the smooth granite stone, feeling the cool autumn chill of the surface, before turning to walk back to her car. As she drove down the highway toward the horizon, the stars began to appear one by one in the vast, clear Ohio sky, shining bright and clear over the quiet farmlands below. The cold case was solved, the truth was complete, and the memory of David Vance rested in everlasting, absolute peace. Plus, the onset of winter in late 2027 brought a quiet, absolute stillness to the high plains of central Ohio, freezing the dark soil of Knox County beneath a thick layer of blue-tinted ice. At the National Center for Cold Case Genetics in Washington, D.C., a special federal symposium was convened to mark the formal integration of the Vance Protocol into standard international law enforcement procedures. The symposium brought together chief forensic officers, federal prosecutors, and molecular geneticists from over 30 nations, all gathered to analyze the historic paradigm shift initiated by a single 1989 cold case in rural Ohio. On the main auditorium screen, a high-definition digital display mapped the evolutionary trajectory of forensic science, from simple fingerprint dusting in the late 19th century to early DNA profiling in the late 1980s, to the revolutionary whole genome somatic mutation analysis that unmasked Daniel Vance 35 years after he executed his identical twin brother. While international delegates analyzed the technical parameters of the breakthrough, retired Detective Karen Mercer sat inside an executive study room at the Library of Congress, where the complete, unredacted historical records of the Vance investigation were being prepared for permanent federal archivation. Among the thousands of digitized documents, laboratory manifests, and trial transcripts lay a newly unsealed collection of federal intelligence memoranda from late 1989, declassified under the mandatory 50-year administrative review provisions of the National Security Archives. These documents, previously classified under high-level federal seals, revealed a terrifying secondary layer of international intrigue that had operated silently beneath the surface of the rural murder investigation for nearly 4 decades. The unsealed federal files demonstrated that in September 1989, 1 month before David Vance was murdered in his mudroom, the United States Department of Justice and the State Department's Counterproliferation Bureau had initiated a covert, top-secret surveillance operation targeting an international consortium of illicit medical hardware brokers operating across North America and Western Europe. The consortium, known in intelligence circles as the Gideon Group, was utilizing unsanctioned Midwestern supply nodes to acquire, modify, and distribute specialized dual-use medical technology, including high-pressure trocars, custom calibration presses, and specialized chemical containment vessels, capable of being repurposed for clandestine biological sampling and illicit surgical operations. The files confirmed that Daniel Vance was not merely a corrupt suburban pharmacist attempting to stave off corporate bankruptcy or steal a family inheritance. He was an active, high-level logistics agent for the Gideon Group, utilizing his Dublin-based medical supply business to route sensitive hardware through rural Ohio farmlands to avoid federal customs inspection. David Vance, through his meticulous botanical and biological field research, had accidentally intercepted a misdirected shipment of specialized steel alloy components delivered to his farm's woodworking barn in the summer of 1989. When David analyzed the metallic composition and custom machining of the components, he realized that his brother was facilitating the movement of hardware designed to bypass international medical oversight and federal safety standards. The declassified memoranda contained a chilling, verbatim transcript of a wiretapped phone call intercepted by federal surveillance operatives on the evening of October 11, 1989, less than 12 hours before David Vance drawn his last breath. The call was placed from a secure line in West Berlin to Daniel Vance's private office in Dublin, Ohio. The international controller's voice was cold, brief, and absolute. The school teacher has the master alignment collar and the logistics ledgers. If those items are delivered to the federal prosecutor in Cleveland tomorrow morning, your company, your assets, and your freedom cease to exist before sunset. Resolve the anomaly immediately. The revelation hit Karen Mercer with the force of an unexpected physical blow. The execution on the morning of October 12, 1989, was not a spontaneous act of sibling rivalry, nor was it simply an isolated domestic murder born out of individual greed. It was a cold, state-level tactical elimination executed under immense international pressure. Daniel Vance had walked into his brother's mudroom, accepted a warm cup of chamomile tea, and delivered a lethal strike with a surgical trocar because he was caught in an iron vice between his brother's unyielding moral integrity and the terrifying threat of an international criminal syndicate that would have eliminated both twins if the ledgers were revealed. Mercer leaned back in her leather chair, staring at the glowing monitor in the quiet reading room of the Library of Congress as the full, magnificent arc of the 38-year mystery reached its absolute, ultimate clarity. David Vance had died not as a passive, helpless victim of a senseless rural burglary, but as a silent, courageous hero who had stood rock solid against an international criminal machine, holding the master alignment collar in his coat pocket and guarding the truth with his life. He had sacrificed everything to ensure that the lethal hardware would never reach the black market, leaving behind a trail of physical and genetic evidence that sat quietly in cardboard storage boxes until modern science was capable of unmasking his killer. The declassified intelligence files further revealed that following David's murder and the total disappearance of the master alignment collar, federal agencies used the disruption to systematically dismantle the Gideon Group's North American distribution nodes, forcing the syndicate into total operational collapse by early 1991. Daniel Vance had spent the remaining 33 years of his life living in comfortable suburban luxury, but he lived as a completely isolated man, abandoned by his international handlers, stripped of his covert influence, and terrified every single day that a shovel, a cold case detective, or an advanced scientific laboratory would eventually dig up the dirt and expose his secret life to the world. In January 2028, a major national documentary series premiered across global television networks, detailing the complete, unredacted story of the Ohio 1989 cold case. The production featured high-definition 3D reconstructions of the crime scene, interviews with forensic geneticists, testimonies from former students, and detailed analysis of the whole genome sequencing that brought down Daniel Vance. The title of the series burned across millions of screens worldwide, echoing the famous headline that had started a global revolution in criminal justice: Ohio 1989 cold case solved, twin brother arrested after 35 years. The documentary highlighted the incredible contrast between the two identical brothers, Daniel, who chose wealth, deception, and murder, only to end his life in a cold prison cell and an unmarked state grave, and David, whose moral courage, scientific passion, and unyielding integrity had birthed a scientific protocol that was now saving lives and solving cold cases across the globe. Viewers around the world marveled at the sheer persistence of truth, learning how a single skin cell trapped beneath the glaze of a ceramic teacup for 35 years could rise from the dust to conquer time, lies, and evil. On a clear, freezing morning in February 2028, Karen Mercer made her final journey out to Knox County, driving her car along the quiet, snow-covered stretches of Highway 36. The rural valley was vast, beautiful, and completely bathed in the brilliant, golden light of the winter sun. She pulled up to the edge of the memorial garden outside the county courthouse, where a newly erected bronze plaque had been added to the granite monument honoring David Vance. The plaque bore a single sentence, chosen by his former students and approved by the state legislature, in honor of David Vance, a silent guardian of truth whose courage transcended time. Mercer stood before the monument in the crisp, cold air, listening to the quiet rustle of the winter wind through the bare branches of the oak trees overhead. She felt no lingering sadness, no unresolved questions, and no cold shadows of doubt. The mystery was solved, the science was proven, the legal system had delivered its judgment, and the deep historical truth was forever secured in the National Archives. The cold case that had haunted a community for nearly 4 decades was complete in every conceivable dimension. She looked up at the vast, clear blue sky above Knox County, feeling the peaceful warmth of the winter sun against her face. The quiet farmlands stretched out into the distance, serene, safe, and forever free of the phantom that had once walked their roads. The headline that had captured the world's imagination was no longer just a news story. It was an invincible monument to the human spirit, a testament that no lie can endure, no killer is untouchable, and no innocent life is ever truly forgotten. Mercer turned and walked back to her car, stepping smoothly onto the highway as the snow glistened like millions of tiny diamonds across the peaceful fields. The journey was over, the work was finished, and the memory of David Vance rested in eternal, absolute, and unshakable light. The arrival of spring in May 2028 brought a soft, green renewal to the timberlands and rolling pastures of Knox County, painting the valley in vibrant shades of emerald under the warm Midwestern sun. At the International Criminal Police Organization headquarters in Lyon, France, the Global Assembly of Forensic Directors formally ratified the Lyons Accord on Genomic Identification Standards, a landmark international treaty that officially codified the Vance Protocol as the global standard for high-complexity human identification in criminal justice. What had begun 38 years earlier as a quiet, unsolved tragedy inside a rural Ohio farmhouse mudroom had expanded into the world's most sophisticated, legally recognized framework for resolving identity fraud, multi-generational cold cases, and identical twin crimes across international borders. In Columbus, Ohio, inside the glass and steel rotunda of the newly constructed David Vance Center for Advanced Genomic Forensics, retired Detective Karen Mercer stood before a high-resolution interactive display detailing the global reach of the protocol. Her role as senior archival advisor to the State Justice Department was drawing to its official, voluntary conclusion. Over the preceding 4 years, since the dramatic unmasking and conviction of Daniel Vance in 2024, the methods developed during the investigation had been deployed in over 400 cold cases across 32 countries. From a 40-year-old missing person mystery along the Rhine River in Germany to a complex dual-identity corporate homicide in Tokyo, the systematic isolation of somatic point mutations, the tiny, inescapable genetic typos that accumulate within living cells over a human lifetime, had provided unambiguous legal closure to families who had waited decades for answers. As Mercer scrolled through the International Case Registry, her screen illuminated a newly filed report from Scotland Yard in London. Investigators in the United Kingdom had successfully utilized the Vance Protocol to resolve a legendary 1978 double homicide involving identical twin brothers who had provided overlapping, impenetrable alibis for nearly half a century. Using ultra-deep genomic sequencing on a microscopic trace of touch DNA recovered from a leather driving glove stored in a Metropolitan Police archive, forensic geneticists had identified 4 distinct, non-heritable base pair substitutions that differentiated the perpetrator from his brother. The protocol had dismantled 50 years of calculated legal deception in less than 72 hours, proving beyond all reasonable doubt that while identical twins share an initial biological blueprint at conception, no 2 human beings, regardless of genetic origin, can live through time without writing their own unique, indelible molecular signature upon the earth. Mercer turned away from the digital console, stepping out onto the sunlit balcony overlooking the capital city. Beside her stood Dr. Raymond Vance, the lead forensic archivist whose painstaking chemical restoration of David Vance's buried, water-damaged journals had unearthed the hidden black market medical supply network 2 years earlier. Dr. Vance held a pristine, leather-bound volume, the newly published first edition of the Compendium of Somatic Mutation Analysis in Criminal Jurisprudence, dedicated to the memory of the Knox County biology teacher whose tragedy had reshaped modern science. Dr. Vance gestured toward the quiet city streets below, where the morning sun reflected off the glass facades of state offices and research laboratories. He remarked that in the history of criminal justice, very few homicide investigations had ever achieved such total, absolute completion. Most cold cases, even when solved, leave behind a lingering trail of unanswered questions, fractured families, or legal compromises. Yet the David Vance investigation had proceeded through every layer of human experience, from the immediate physical horror of the crime scene to the cutting edge of molecular biology, from the unearthing of hidden subterranean vaults to the exposure of an international distribution syndicate, and finally to the establishment of an enduring educational legacy that funded the futures of hundreds of young scientists. Mercer smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the quiet wisdom of a career spent pursuing truth in the darkest corners of human nature. She noted that while the high-tech sequencing machines, the mathematical algorithms, and the federal task forces had provided the tools for victory, the true heart of the investigation had always been moral rather than technological. The case was solved because David Vance had possessed the courage to document the truth in his journal before he died, because a rural deputy in 1989 had preserved a single ceramic teacup in a sterile cardboard box, and because a team of dedicated investigators refused to accept the comfortable lie that 35 years of silence meant the case was dead. Later that afternoon, Mercer made her final official visit to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation's Central Evidence Vault in London, Ohio. She had been invited by the state director to oversee the permanent sealing of case file 89-0412, KV, the master physical repository containing every fragment of evidence gathered from the farmhouse on Highway 36. Inside the climate-controlled vault, sitting upon a pristine stainless steel table, were the original physical artifacts that had defined her life for nearly a decade, the yellowed index cards written in David's hand, the heavy brass pressure alignment collar recovered from his coat pocket, the antique keys to the Richland County grain silo, the sealed ceramic teacup, and the original, degraded touch DNA extraction tubes from 2024. As Mercer prepared to lower the heavy plexiglass security shield over the primary evidence container, an archivist handed her a small, newly processed box that had been transferred to the Bureau from the estate of David Vance's late high school principal. The box contained an item that had sat forgotten in a storage closet at the local school district office for nearly 40 years, an old, reel-to-reel magnetic audio tape labeled Classroom Lecture, Principles of Cellular Mutation and Time, Mr. Vance, September 28, 1989. The archivist placed the magnetic tape onto a restored vintage playback unit, adjusting the audio levels as the room fell into a respectful, expectant silence. After a brief hiss of static, the clear, warm, and resonant voice of David Vance echoed through the high-tech laboratory vault, a voice recorded 2 weeks before his life was brutally stolen in his own mudroom. In the recording, David was speaking to a senior biology class, his tone filled with the gentle, captivating enthusiasm of a dedicated educator who loved the natural world. When we look at a strand of DNA under a microscope, David's voice chimed through the speakers, we are not merely looking at a chemical recipe for life. We're looking at a history book. Every time a cell divides, every time an organism breathes, lives, and reacts to its environment, nature makes microscopic marks upon the code. Time itself leaves a trail. You can try to mask it, you can try to copy it, but you can never erase the fact that life records every single step it takes. In the end, nature is the ultimate witness, and nature never forgets. The words hung in the quiet air of the vault, striking everyone present with a profound, almost supernatural chill. 38 years before his own identical twin brother attempted to erase his existence and steal his identity using their shared genetic code, David Vance had explained to a room of 17-year-old high school students the exact scientific principle that would eventually rise from the grave to deliver him justice. His words were not just an educational lecture. They were a prophetic, unshakable declaration of the law of the universe. Mercer felt a warm tear trace its way down her cheek, a rare moment of emotion from a woman who had spent 40 years maintaining absolute professional composure in the face of tragedy. She reached forward, lowered the security shield over the evidence container, and turned the heavy mechanical lock, securing case file 89-0412, KV into the permanent archives of history forever. The physical evidence was sealed, the recording was digitized for future generations, and the truth was locked in absolute, unyielding perfection. As the sun began to set over the central Ohio countryside, Mercer drove her car out of the Crime Bureau complex, taking the long, familiar route north toward Knox County. The evening air was cool and fragrant with the scent of wild lilacs and blooming hawthorn trees. She bypassed the bustling highway, navigating the quiet back roads that wound through the gentle hills, past the well-tended timber lots, and alongside the clear, sparkling waters of the Kokosing River. She stopped her vehicle near the edge of the old Vance farm on Highway 36. The sun was dipping below the western horizon, casting long, golden rays across the green fields where David Vance had once walked, gathered plant samples, and watched the seasonal shifts of the land he loved. The farmhouse stood peaceful in the warm twilight, its windows glowing with light from a new young family who had purchased the property after its complete legal exoneration, a home restored to life, laughter, and light, scrubbed clean of the cold shadow that had once lingered in its mudroom. Mercer walked down the fence line to the memorial garden, stepping up to the granite monument that bore David's name and the new bronze plaque that honored his memory. She placed her hand upon the smooth, cool stone, feeling the deep, silent peace that enveloped the valley. The headline that had once dominated national news networks, Ohio 1989 cold case solved, twin brother arrested after 35 years, was no longer just an investigation, a legal trial, or a scientific victory. It was a permanent part of the moral fabric of the world, a timeless story that proved light will always pierce the deepest dark, no matter how many years the dark may reign. She looked up into the darkening sky, where the first bright stars of the evening were beginning to shine over the quiet farmlands. The air was still, the fields were at rest, and the long, extraordinary road that had begun on an autumn morning in 1989 had finally reached its ultimate, beautiful, and everlasting home. Detective Karen Mercer stepped back into her car, started the engine, and drove peacefully away into the quiet Ohio night, knowing that justice was complete, the truth was eternal, and David Vance was finally at rest. Vance drew his last breath on the cool linoleum floor of his Knox County farmhouse mudroom. Across central Ohio, the golden canopy of autumn leaves mirrored the exact atmospheric stillness that had blanketed the Kokosing River Valley 50 years earlier on October 12, 1989. In the decades following the revolutionary 2024 arrest and conviction of Daniel Vance, the passage of time had transformed a brutal domestic tragedy into one of the most celebrated chapters in the global history of forensic science and human justice. What had once been a dark, unresolved cold case buried beneath 35 years of dust, silence, and suburban deception was now taught in law enforcement academies, university medical centers, and legal institutions from North America to Eastern Europe and East Asia. Inside the glass and limestone auditorium of the David Vance Institute for Forensic Science at The Ohio State University in Columbus, an international delegation of geneticists, legal scholars, and federal investigators gathered for the 50th anniversary Symposium on Somatic Mutation Analysis and Cold Case Resolution. The keynote address was delivered by Dr. Elena Mercer Vance, a distinguished molecular geneticist and the daughter of a former junior deputy who had worked under the late Detective Karen Mercer during the historic 2024 investigation. Dr. Mercer Vance stood before a digital display projecting a pristine, high-resolution rendering of a single human cell, its nuclear double helix illuminated with microscopic crimson highlights denoting the subtle, somatic point mutations that differentiate identical twins over a lifetime of biological existence. Addressing the audience of global researchers, Dr. Mercer Vance reflected upon the long, complex journey that had begun in a quiet rural township 5 decades earlier. She noted that when David Vance was executed in 1989, the scientific world possessed only a rudimentary understanding of human DNA profiling, incapable of distinguishing between two identical twins who shared an identical inherited genome at birth. For 35 years, Daniel Vance had exploited that scientific limitation, hiding behind his brother's shared genetic signature and living a life of immaculate, suburban luxury in Dublin, Ohio. He had believed that time was his ultimate ally, that the erosion of biological tissue and the accumulation of years would forever obscure the identity of the man who had held the surgical trocar. Yet, as Dr. Mercer Vance pointed out to the assembly, time had not operated as the killer's protector. It had operated as nature's quiet, incorruptible ledger. Every breath Daniel Vance took, every chemical reaction inside his dividing cells, and every year he lived in secret had written a unique, unalterable pattern of non-heritable mutations into his physical tissue. When modern high-depth genomic sequencing was brought to bear upon a single, preserved TouchDNA sample in 2024, those tiny, microscopic typos in his genetic code spoke with absolute, mathematical clarity. The law of nature had caught up with the calculated lie of man, proving that no individual, no matter how clever, wealthy, or genetically identical to his victim, can live through time without leaving an indelible signature upon the physical world. The symposium also featured the formal release of the 50-year historical compendium of the Vance Protocol, an exhaustive multi-volume federal publication documenting the systemic impact of the case on global jurisprudence. The records revealed that in the 15 years since the international adoption of the Lyons Accord, the genomic profiling techniques pioneered during the Vance investigation had provided definitive legal resolution in over 900 historical cold cases worldwide. Dormant evidence files dating back to the mid-20th century, unidentified victims of violent crime, complex dual-identity homicides, and long-standing missing persons cases across multiple continents had been reopened and brought to final, unquestioned closure. In Knox County, the commemoration took on a more intimate, deeply personal tone. Along Highway 36, the old Vance farmhouse stood bathed in the warm, amber glow of the autumn sun. The wooden barn where David had once conducted his biological experiments and hidden the secondary ledgers had been meticulously restored by the local Historical Preservation Society, transformed into a quiet educational center dedicated to environmental biology and rural science education. High school students from across central Ohio regularly visited the farm, walking through the peaceful gardens where David had gathered plant specimens and studying the precise botanical logs he had left behind. In Mount Vernon, the historical trust established by David and Daniel's mother in 1965 and anonymously funded for 34 years by Daniel's guilt-ridden offshore wire transfers had grown into one of the largest private educational endowments in the Midwest. By 2039, the trust had provided full academic scholarships to over 300 young men and women from rural Ohio, producing a generation of scientific leaders, public health directors, and forensic pioneers who carried David Vance's passion for truth into research facilities across the globe. The financial enterprise that Daniel had constructed to shield his crime had been completely repurposed by justice, turning the proceeds of illicit ambition into an eternal spring of knowledge, healing, and discovery. At the Knox County Courthouse Memorial Garden, a quiet, unannounced gathering took place in the late afternoon. Retired federal agents, former state crime lab directors, local law enforcement veterans, and community members gathered around the gray granite monument where David Vance's name was engraved alongside the bronze plaque celebrating his moral courage. Among those in attendance was 91-year-old former Special Agent Marcus Vance of the FBI, who had led the federal task force that dismantled the secondary medical supply network hidden in the Richland County grain silo in 2027. Agent Vance stood quietly before the stone, looking out over the clear, peaceful valley where the Kokosing River wound through the vibrant autumn woods. He reflected on the strange, winding arc of an investigation that had spanned nearly half a century. He recalled the early days of October 1989, when local deputies had stood in the cold autumn rain outside the mudroom door, frustrated by dead-end leads, missing evidence, and the impenetrable shield of an identical twin alibi. He recalled the long years of silence when the case file sat in a metal drawer inside the sheriff's office, labeled as an unsolved tragedy that many feared would never see the light of day. And yet, as Agent Vance looked around the peaceful memorial garden, he recognized that justice had not merely arrived, it had arrived with absolute,